Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed guests and participants, welcome to the 5th Africa Regulatory Conference. It is my great honor to open this remarkable event today. On behalf of IFPMA, International Federation of Pharmaceutical Manufacturers and Associations, and its sister associations, LAM, CAPI, AREPI, and IPAS. My name is Nevena Miletic. I am part of the Global Regulatory Science and Policy team in Roche, and co-chair of the IFPMA's Africa Regulatory Network. The Africa Regulatory Conference has come a long way since its inception years ago. It was established as a platform to bring together key players in the regulatory landscape across the African continent. Our goal was to foster collaboration, dialogue, and innovation in the field of regulatory affairs, and to support harmonization efforts on the continent. We are pleased to have the new opportunity to reconnect again since 2015, this time using modern digital technology and tools that allow us to be connected and to collaborate. And this is what the motto of this event is: working together for the benefits of patients. Over the years, industry in IFPMA, its sister associations and member companies worked together with AMRH partners and stakeholders to strengthen regulatory systems across the continent with its expertise, resources, and innovation. The AMRH initiative has brought together regulatory authorities from across Africa to streamline processes, enhance capacity, and accelerate the approval of medicinal products. Now, we eagerly anticipate the imminent establishment of the African Medicines Agency, AMA. AMA promises to be a unifying force, offering a coordinated approach to regulations that will benefit both regulators, industry, and most importantly, the health and well-being of African people. In this significant moment, we created this conference as a platform to identify the progress we should celebrate and to reflect on the areas where we should put more efforts to ensure AMA and the continent are ready for the new era. The theme of the 5th African Regulatory Conference is Together for Patients, Transforming the Regulatory Ecosystem in Africa. So what you can expect from this year's Africa Regulatory Conference? Over the course of this week, the conference will explore the wide range of topics. Today, under the headline, How Can the Regulatory Ecosystem in Africa be Strengthened?, we will discuss regional harmonization efforts, facilitated regulatory pathways, and also clinical research readiness of the continent. Tomorrow, on day 2, we will dive deeper into all aspects of regulatory reliance, as well as into optimizing regulatory frameworks for management of post-approval changes. Day 3 is focusing on the new trends and innovation. We will explore how learnings and development of new technologies and regulatory agilities could support efficient operationalization of AMA and overall regulatory ecosystem in the continent. And finally, on day 4, we will start with a fireside chat with patients, and we will continue with a discussion on how to create a sustainable ecosystem for the biopharmaceutical industry, and finally conclude with some way forward for the new agency, AMA. The conference will also host 2 satellite symposium sessions, first one dedicated to pharmacovigilance and the second one to the biosimilars, to be held in the coming weeks. I hope you will find many reasons to join us for the whole event. I would like also to extend my heartfelt gratitude to the program committee, experts who have meticulously crafted this agenda to ensure that we provide you with valuable discussions and practical insights. Their dedication and vision have been instrumental in shaping this event. Also, my thanks to all speakers and panelists, experts, and thought leaders, and to the diligent IFPMA team that worked tirelessly in previous months to make sure you have an excellent experience. Before we continue, allow me to just run through a few housekeeping details with you to remind you that this conference will be held in English with simultaneous interpretation in French and Portuguese, so please feel free to select the most suitable channel for you. All participants will be muted, but we encourage you to use the Q&A tool to raise any questions that you may have for speakers and panelists. Please note that there is also an option to like or vote for a question that has already been posted, so that we also encourage you to use that one. In some sessions, participants will also have the opportunity to use Mentimeter polls, so we really appreciate this opportunity for you to engage with us throughout the week. And the last one, the full conference is being recorded, and all presentations and videos will be made available on the Africa Regulatory Conference website after the event is closed. In addition, all the bios and the photos of all the speakers and panelists throughout the week can be found on the conference website. In closing, I encourage all of you to engage wholeheartedly in the discussion, to share your insights and forge new partnerships. Together, we can continue to drive progress, innovation, and positive change in the regulatory landscape of the African continent. With that, I have the immense honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Mrs. Margaret Mbondo-Sigonda. For many of us, Margaret is the icon and the face of AMRH initiative. Currently, she is the AMRH and AMA advisor for African Union Development Agency and African Union Commission. Thank you very much for joining us today, Margaret, and the floor is yours.
Right. Hey, Nevena?
We have Margaret?
Yes, it seems that Margaret disconnected for a second, but we're trying to get her back in. Give us just a minute.
Thank you.
Hey, Nevena? Shall we move to the Mentimeter and start getting people's feedback, and then once Margaret reconnects, we can go back to her introductory remarks? Is that okay?
Sure. Would you like to move to the next slide then? Mm-hmm. Good. So while we are waiting for Margaret to join us, we actually introduced also this interactive. Hello?
I'm here.
Oh, perfect. Thanks a lot, Margaret.
It's a network problem. Sorry about that.
No worries. Glad that we have you here. So I was just briefly introducing you, and we're all looking forward to hear for your introduction speech. So can I hand over right away to you? Many thanks.
Thank you very much, Nevena. Please allow me to express my sincere appreciation to the organizing committee for inviting me to speak during this very important conference for the industry, the regulators, and other stakeholders. I've been asked to speak about the transforming the regulatory ecosystem in Africa. And I thought gives an outline of what I'll be speaking to you. I would like to take you through the new public health order for which the African heads of state and government have committed to. And after I have done that, then I'll go to the changing regulatory landscape in Africa. And then I'll talk about the ratification of the Treaty for Establishment of the African Medicines Agency and its operationalization process as a shared responsibility, and then I'll conclude. And so if you can take me to the next slide, please. As you may all be aware, in 2021, after the COVID pandemic had hit the globe, it was very clear that the African continent was the most exposed because of its vulnerability in the healthcare delivery system. And so the issue of ensuring access to vital drugs, vaccines, and health technologies was a big challenge. And we are all aware of the fact that the continent was sidelined in the global rush for vaccines in 2021 and 2022. And currently we have fewer than half of the African population that has been fully vaccinated. And we see the major limitation to access of medicines and the needed quality healthcare services by the majority of African population is due to the grappling healthcare delivery system on the continent. And this is the reason why the African heads of state and government decided to come up with a strategy called the New Public Health Order, which calls for Africa to protect itself against the threat of infectious diseases, and it has also entrusted the Africa CDC as an AU entity with the responsibility of promoting the prevention and control of diseases in Africa. Next slide, please. And one of the key aspects in the New Public Health Order is the framework for partnership for African vaccine manufacturing, PAVM. This is an offshoot of the Public Health Order, which calls for Africa to protect itself against the threat of infectious diseases, including the need for expanded manufacturing of vaccines, diagnostics, and therapeutics. The overall goal of the PAVM framework is to attain local production of 60% of vaccines that are needed on the continent by 2040. And one of the bold programs under the PAVM framework is regulatory system strengthening. This is a pillar implemented under the PAVM framework, but it is being anchored under the African Medicines Regulatory Harmonization Initiative. And the idea is that once AMA is operational, then it will take on the responsibility of ensuring coordination of these workstream, regulatory systems strengthening workstream under the PAVM framework. But I think it's also very important to remind ourselves that all these frameworks and initiatives are built on and anchored under the foundation of the Pharmaceutical Manufacturing Plan for Africa, which was endorsed by the AU states, heads of state and government in 2005. Next slide, please. So having given that background, I would like to take you through the changing regulatory landscape in Africa. We all know in the past, the reports had shown, and especially WHO reports, the capacity limitations for national regulatory agencies. The reports actually showed then that 7% of the African countries' national regulatory agencies have moderately developed capacity, but more than 90% of the agencies have either minimal or no capacity at all. And so with the establishment of the MRH initiative in 2009, the aim was to address the weak and outdated laws coupled with fragmented regulatory system on the African continent using regional structures. The vision under the MRH initiative was to move from the 55 national regulatory agencies operating separately to a regional harmonization approach, which eventually will feed into a continental framework through the African Medicines Agency. Next slide, please. And so we've seen under the MRH vision, the idea was to streamline, to harmonize regulatory processes, guidelines, procedures, and standards of practice, working through the regional economic communities covering the entire continent, with a view to start slowly with harmonization of registration processes and eventually moving into other regulatory functions such as clinical trial oversight, pharmacovigilance, and so forth and so forth. But also the idea under the MRH initiative was to really pool resources and ensure information sharing among all the key stakeholders, including the NRIs themselves. The other important component under the MRH initiative was to ensure that we have transparent regulatory processes with clear timelines, but also have strong institutionalized regulatory capacity and system strengthening programs through training and training programs. And also to have a single set of requirements with clear guidelines, fewer dossiers to prepare, essentially meaning that an applicant would have to submit one application through a regional structure. The overall end goal was to ensure that we have earlier approval of more medical products and vaccines on the continent. And you can see here that this is a continuum, moving from national, regional, and continental levels as we progress. Next. So this slide speaks to the key milestones that we have attained so far under the MRH initiative. The first is that through the AU model law on medical products regulation, we've seen countries having comprehensive medicines laws, more than 17 countries at the moment. They have very comprehensive medicines laws. They also have autonomous agencies. I've just given an example of all the countries in East African community, but I know, for instance, in West Africa, more than 50% of the member states also have semi-autonomous agencies. And equally, we are seeing a trend in Southern Africa and also Central and North Africa as well. But also, we've seen countries using the provisions, for instance, under the model law on reliance in a meaningful way that would facilitate approval of products. And a case in point here is the South African Health Products Regulatory Authority, which was able to clear its backlog by using the reliance provision through the Zazibona framework, and they were able to really ensure that the products were approved much faster than initially was the case. We've also seen strengthened national regulatory agencies. As you all know, we have now 5 NRAs on the continent that have attained maturity level 3, which essentially is a sign of having robust regulatory system that can be trusted in a country, and of course, eventually regionally and at the continental level. But also, we've seen robust regional medicines regulatory harmonization initiatives in East African Community, SADC region, ECOWAS, Central Africa, IGAD, and of course, now we are also seeing the Arab Maghreb Union also coming on board with harmonized standards, and of course, planning to do joint review and inspections. And actually, there is a very good progress in this area, which I'll speak to on my next slide. But also, the regions have very clear governance structures with steering committees that constituted by heads of agencies, forum themselves, but also expert working groups have been established. We've also seen strong governance structures at continental level, where we have all the heads of agencies meeting as the assembly of all the 55 NRAs under the AMRC. We also see a lot of interaction between NRAs, regional economic communities, but also we have a strong steering committee at continental level with technical committees, partners platform, and strong secretariat that is jointly managed by AUD, NEPAD, and WHO. We are also seeing sustainable regional centers of regulatory excellence that are supporting capacity building initiatives. We initially had the centers supporting 8 regulatory functions, but now we have new developments where 4 more have been assigned to undertake vaccines regulatory oversight capacity building programs. And as I said, a partnership platform has also been very instrumental to provide technical, financial, and policy advocacy support. Next. In terms of the regional initiative, I don't want to spend much time here, but suffice to say, at least for ECOWAS, more than 24 applications have been received up to date. For SADC, we have seen 390 applications received. For East African Community, 235 applications received. IGAD, we've seen 30 applications. And of course, ECAS is also busy working on how to work together, but at least they have developed an overarching regional pharmaceutical policy framework. Next. Now here, I want to spend a little time here so that at least you can appreciate where we stand in terms of the MRH technical committees. We have 10 MRH technical committees at different levels of development. Some are fully established, some have been revived, some are still at the stage of development, but I will focus on those in red. We have the AVAREF that is focusing on clinical trial oversight, coordinating joint review of vaccines clinical trial applications. We have the African Medicine Quality Forum, which is responsible for quality control and market surveillance, but also it is now busy working on a network of laboratories to support the lot release aspect for vaccines so that they will be able to expeditiously approve vaccines that are being produced on the continent. We have a GMP-TC, Regulatory Capacity Development TC, Medicines Policy and Regulatory Reform, Information Management System, and also evaluation of medical products. But here I'll focus on 2 that at a stage where we have, for instance, GMP-TC and the evaluation of medical products TC, they are jointly working together to produce continental guidelines and standards for which they are now under stakeholder consultation for which the industry is expected to provide some inputs. But also they have developed, for instance, the GMP-TC inspection of manufacturing sites guidelines, including APIs. And jointly, they have come up with a continental procedure for evaluation of priority medicinal products. And the idea is to support and coordinate joint review at continental level under a pilot program. And hopefully before the end of this year, we'll see a pilot of the continental procedure for evaluation of medical products being piloted, implemented on the continent. And this is meant to pave way for the African Medicines Agency to really, take on the responsibility, immediately once it is fully operational. Next. And on this slide, what I'm trying to share is the role of the regional centers of regulatory excellence. We've had initially 11 of them that were designated in 2014 that have been very instrumental in supporting countries to build their capacity. But of recent, we have had 4 that have been designated to undertake vaccine regulatory oversight. But the key aspect this time has been the ability of the NRA to attain ML3 status. And so we have 4 of them that have been assigned. Some of them are working jointly. For instance, for lot release functions, we have Egypt and South Africa working together to support countries to do that. And I think what is also very important is to recognize the fact that the regional centers of regulatory excellence are a partnership between academic institutions, that provide technical training in regulatory science, but also they partner with the national regulatory agencies. And the idea is to ensure that they enhance skills through hands-on training and exchange programs. And we've seen a lot happening in Ghana, FDA and TMDA, together with their respective universities. They have done practical training through placement. They've done operational research and piloting innovations, interventions to inform best practice. And we see that in the AMA Treaty, there is a provision where AMA will be responsible for coordinating the existing and new regional centers of regulatory excellence. And the question is, can the ARACOs serve as the regional centers for AMA as it becomes operational, just like we see Africa CDC having regional centers in all the 5 geographic regions of the continent? This is a question that I'm posing for stakeholders to discuss, because I think it can really be something that may provide a lot of value to use these centers as regional centers for the African Medicines Agency. Next slide, please. So now I want to take you to the updates on the AMA ratification process. We have 26 countries that have ratified and deposited the instrument of ratification with the African Union Commission, but we still have a lot more others that haven't done so. And I think what is very, very important is for all the stakeholders to see that we have a responsibility of advocating for the ratification of AMA. And I think it's also very important to note the fact that a strong AMA will be based on strong national regulatory agency. So it's very important also we look into those countries that have not ratified and deposited the instrument so that we can advocate they become part of the conference of the state parties for AMA. We have, for instance, Nigeria here, we have Tanzania, we have South Africa that have yet to ratify and deposit their instrument of ratification. So I think we need to seriously look into this and see how best we can do that. Next. And this, again, is really to call upon all the key stakeholders here. We know governments have a role to continue advocacy, but also to invest in strengthening regulatory system at the country level. Regulators, they have a role to ensure effective and efficient regulatory services, to avail competent experts to the regional and continental structures, to build robust regulatory system and processes, including the digitalization process. But also the industry has a role to do advocacy. And here, I think I want to pose a question to you as the industry player. What have you done in your capacity to advocate? We know you have access to politicians. What have you done to ensure that AMA is ratified as soon as possible in various countries that we are focusing for at the moment? But also the industry has a role to participate in the development of guidelines and standards, and we bank on you to contribute to this process. We have patients and civil service organizations that have a role in advocacy. The involvement in the technical committees for patients, especially for the evaluation of medical product technical committee, I think it's very important that we look into how best all the key players take part so that we eventually have AMA that is strong, that is able to provide the services that is intended to do. Next. So the next is my conclusion, and I'm quoting a statement from Sidibe's publication. It says, the African Medicines Agency can enable African people to live the healthier lives they deserve while boosting continental trade and economic development. But I think it's also very important to underscore the fact that AMA needs wider support and investment for it to be operationalized with urgency, building on emirate gains, to provide an enabling regulatory environment for local production and trade among countries. And we now have the African Continental Free Trade Area that I think provides a huge market, which AMA can have a big contribution to ensure that there's free movement of medical products and that eventually trade is facilitated through the AMA process. And AMA, it's also important to underscore the fact that it has a key role in improving the health and well-being of Africans, and provides an opportunity to design and implement continental regulatory system for African people by African people and leveraging African capabilities and talent. And with that, I want to thank you once again for inviting me to speak during this event. And I really want to wish you all a fruitful deliberations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Margaret. This was really excellent and very insightful presentation, and such a great progress achieved in the continent. We look forward to hear more also about the development of those regional centers of regulatory excellence that you mentioned, and what role they could play to support AMA's mission and objectives. And also we acknowledge that all stakeholders need to be on board and have a shared responsibility to support AMA achieving its ambitious goals. We are actually foreseeing the discussion in more detail on the industry engagement on AMA during the last session of the conference that is going to be dedicated to African Medicines Agency. With that, I want to leave all of you with one thought that I would like us to have during all the upcoming conversations, which is how we all can work together to improve the lives of patients in African countries. I think it goes very well and aligned with Margaret's message that all stakeholders have a role to play in improving the system. Thank you once again for dedicating your time to join us, and I wish you a fulfilling, inspiring, and insightful conversation.
Thank you.
With that, I think we can start with the session 1 of the conference. So the session 1 is titled Navigating the Maze and Simplifying the Path to Efficient National Registration of Medicinal Products. As we have heard, AMRH initiative moved many aspects in the regulatory systems in the continent. One of the key areas was engagement with regional economic communities and development of regional harmonized regulations and registration pathways. At the same time, we are witnessing that regulatory reliance and work sharing have been recognized as 21st century regulatory tool and are being utilized more and more to support regulatory decisions making globally. Did you know that worldwide there is more than 15 different collaborative registration pathways established to support faster and more efficient assessment of medicinal products globally? And then more than half of those are actually relevant for Africa, either being established on the regional level or being global, but with participation of African national regulatory authorities. With this in mind, we wanted to start this session by asking you, how is your experience and how familiar are you with facilitated regulatory pathways and collaborative registration procedures in Africa? So I would like to invite you to please take your phones and share your thoughts with us by scanning the QR code that you can see here on the screen, and respond to us on the question, how familiar are you with facilitated pathways and collaborative registration procedures in Africa? Do you have good understanding? Have you used them? Have you heard about them? So for information, we have over 250, almost 300 participants today. So it would be nice to have this also represented in your responses. Thank you. So it seems that majority of our audience have some understanding of those procedures, and some of them have used them, but there is still obvious slight reluctance in using them. We are still receiving some responses. I think that's it. So maybe we can move to the next slide. As we've heard, Africa is a fast-developing region, and African regulatory systems showed some significant progress in previous decade on the wave of ongoing AMRH initiative. So we have seen development in efficient national registration pathways and also pathways based on reliance in the countries. We also appreciate the development of numerous priority review pathways in some countries, ensuring accelerated assessment procedures for selected therapies. As mentioned by Margaret, many countries are also strengthening their regulatory systems, obtaining WHO maturity level 3 designation, some becoming ICH members, observers. A number of regions across Africa have established regional joint assessment procedures with the aim to harmonize this regional regulatory requirements and improve regulatory ecosystems and accelerate marketing authorization procedure to enable faster access to medicines. We are expecting soon establishment of African Medicines Agency that is also foreseen to contribute somewhat to the continental efforts in regulatory assessment. And then there are already mentioned global pathways that also provide opportunities for bringing therapies for African patients faster. So how we as an applicant, having such numerous opportunities, could select the optimal one? Just last week, Frontiers in Medicine published the results of the extensive project I and my colleagues from Africa Regulatory Network team have undertook to assess all those procedures from the perspective of innovative industry. And you will have the opportunity to hear about that in a bit. But I'm very excited to have excellent speakers and panelists today with me today to discuss the emergence of the facilitated regulatory pathways and learnings from recent experiences and how we can navigate this complex ecosystem to achieve what is our ultimate objective, and that is faster approval as a first step towards faster access to medicinal products in Africa. We will start this session with the two presentations from the WHO and from SEERS, and then we will move to panel discussion with representatives from regions, national regulatory authorities, and industry. We will then conclude with some recommendations for the way forward. As mentioned earlier, all speakers' bios and photos are available on the conference website, and I want to encourage you once again to use the Q&A option to post your questions and comments to our speakers and panelists, as we will also allocate some time to respond to your questions from the floor. With that, allow me to hand over to Dr. Mariana Roldal Santos, Technical Officer for Facilitated Product Introductions within a Regulation and Prequalification Department in World Health Organization. Mariana, the floor is yours and you have 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nevena. So I would like to just start. Thank you for your introduction as well. I think the scene has been very well set by the previous two speakers. But before actually we go into which are those facilitated regulatory pathways available, CRP and joint assessments, I just would like to acknowledge, in my next slide, please, that indeed the regulatory authorities of all countries worldwide, they carry this great responsibility of ensuring not only access to quality products, but also timely access. And obviously due to several factors, some internal, some external, such as global health emergencies, as we have been experienced in the last years, the authorities very often, they tend to feel overwhelmed, which leads to lengthy regulatory approvals and a compromised patients' timely access to much needed products. So these called facilitated regulatory pathways, they came as a solution from many authorities. And I would like to also emphasize and note some data that was provided by Margaret in her previous notes, that 70% of the countries worldwide, they have authorities with considered weak regulatory systems, so systems that are not functional. So having said that, and as many authorities in the meantime with the experience of COVID-19 pandemics have experienced the application of reliance, the real use and practice with the application of reliance, these facilitated regulatory pathways, they have been acknowledged as being a very useful tool and pathways that are meant to facilitate and accelerate not only the assessment, but also the registration of quality assured products. So while it accelerates the process, it still ensures the quality of the products to their populations. So these pathways, they use these two concepts, reliance and collaboration, very much spoken in previous notes. And when they are properly implemented in the authorities, they help the authorities to leverage on the work performed by others so improving therefore the efficiency of their regulatory systems. They also help authorities to avoid duplication of regulatory work, optimize their human and financial resources, increasing also expertise and build capacities, because many authorities reported that when using these pathways, they learn on how others also do conduct the assessments. So there is a strong capacity building component here. And of course, NRAs also can experience, when properly implementing these pathways, the reduction in terms of time needed to process a product application, reduce the reduction of the workload in general terms, and ultimately to ensure the timely access to quality products. My next slide, please. So these pathways, they came as a solution to many authorities, and this was particularly experienced, as I mentioned, during COVID-19 pandemics. But what are those pathways available? So I would like just to show you very quickly all the registration pathways that are available to countries based on WHA Resolution 67.20. And out of these 5, 4 of them, they are considered, those considered to be the facilitated registration pathways. And these are the joint assessment, the work sharing, a bridge review, and recognition. So just to give you some examples, for example, for the joint assessment, it happens when the assessment is conducted between 2 or more countries, and they can either apply reliance or not as part of their joint assessment. One example is, for instance, the EAC. Joint assessment that happens in Africa, or the EMA centralized procedure, or the ASEAN joint assessment for those that are also not aware of it. Then the work sharing, it happens when it's agreed between 2 or more countries that one performs the assessment while the other will be granting the registration, the authorization, based on the assessment of the first one. So one example where this happens very often is through the European decentralized procedure, and also through the ZAZIBON procedure. Then we have the bridge review and the recognition. So these are 2 pathways that are very similar. They differ from the level of effort that the authority needs to apply to when conducting both. So the bridge review, it means that one authority will have access to the existing assessment report of that product that was conducted by a reference authority or institution. So the authority will still significantly consider the assessment that was conducted by others, and therefore will perform their own assessment and registration much quicker, but they will still conduct their own secondary review. So this is called the bridge review. So a strong application of reliance, but with this component of a secondary review. The recognition pathway, it's very similar. So the authority gets access to the assessment reports or the approval of a product that was conducted by another reference authority or institution. However, in this case, the authority decides to fully recognize what has been already assessed by others, and it does not conduct additional assessments. So there is no further review. Generally, in these cases, the authority verifies the sameness between what has been provided to them and what has been assessed by the reference authority, without the need of conducting additional assessment. So both of these pathways, they are strongly used in one of these facilitated pathways called CRP. So I would call CRP as a mechanism, not as a pathway. So we consider the recognition and the bridge review the pathway, and the mechanism where these pathways can be utilized is, for instance, the CRP, the collaborative registration procedure, which we'll be speaking in a second. I just wanted to emphasize that countries at all maturity levels, so more countries with high regulatory systems with higher maturity levels, or countries with regulatory systems with lower maturity levels, all of them, they can benefit from all these tools. So they are available to all the countries, and a country that, for example, has higher maturity level in terms of regulatory systems for pharmaceutical products, they can be a reference authority for some products, for some countries, but they can also be benefiting from reliance to other products. So these pathways, they do not undermine the capacity of the country, of the authority, to perform these assessment activities. It just provides this additional benefit and these additional tools for all the countries at all maturity levels, with regulatory systems at all maturity levels, to benefit from them, to make the regulatory system more efficient. And I also heard that Margaret mentioned that 5 countries in Africa reach maturity level 3. I also would like to inform that out of these 5, 4 of them, they significantly use a CRP, collaborative registration procedure, for several years. So actually these tools, they help countries to focus on those activities where they cannot rely on others, where they need to be conducting those activities by themselves, and therefore making their own regulatory system more efficient to reach higher maturity levels. So this is actually a tool for countries to obtain more efficiencies, and therefore in terms of regulatory systems, obviously, and therefore to also reach higher maturity levels when it comes to pharmaceutical regulatory activities. My next slide, please. So when it comes to CRP, how does it work? So the process is always triggered by the applicant, and where there is interest from the applicant to make one submission to multiple CRP countries. So the applicant expressed the interest to make the submission, product submission, to multiple CRP countries. It can be to 1 country, to 5, to 50 participating CRP countries. So it's up to the company to decide. And the concept behind is that the company providing the same product dossier to these multiple CRP participating countries, together with the product assessment reports, either from reference authorities or WHO pre-qualification team, then countries will be in the best position to be able to apply reliance to what has been already assessed for that product, and therefore they are in a good position to accelerate the assessment and registration of products and ensuring a faster access to these products by their own population. So TRP in the end is just this mechanism that allows the companies to make this submission of the same product information to multiple countries at the same time, and this will also allow countries to be in a good position to apply reliance and therefore to accelerate their own assessment. My next slide, please. We have at the moment 2 types of CRP. So it's the CRP for products that have been pre-qualified by WHO via full assessment, and this applies to medicines, vaccines, biotherapeutics, and in vitro diagnostics. And then we have CRP for products that have been approved by stringent regulatory authorities. I will tell you in a second which are those considered to be stringent regulatory authorities. But so this means that any product, as far as it has been approved by one of these SRAs, one of these stringent regulatory authorities, it will be eligible to be submitted via SRA CRP to the CRP participating countries. And this can go, so these are products that can go from innovative to generic products, either chemical or biological entities, or products that were submitted via special routes such as the EU Medicines for All, also known as Article 58, or the Swiss Martin Global Health Products Program. Another big advantage of SRA CRP is that it has no restrictions in terms of therapeutic area. So no restrictions in terms of which type of product, and also no restrictions in terms of, or limitations in terms of therapeutic areas. Next slide, please. Thank you. So as I mentioned, the process, it's not very complex. So the applicant is the one triggering the process by providing expression of interest to the respective authorities where it's interested to make the submission to. And when the authority confirms acceptance of using CRP for that product, then the authority will be provided with a full product dossier in ICH-CTD format, the assessment reports that include scientific evaluations and GMP inspection reports, and the quiz, which is a quality information summary document that is validated by the SRA or by WHO pre-qualification. So this quiz is the document that will help countries to quickly verify the sameness of the product, which is very important because it helps countries to take their decisions much quicker by having access to this quiz. So then when countries have access to this information, they have 90 working days to come up to conduct their assessment and come up with their regulatory outcome, either approval or rejection. And also another good benefit of this procedure is that the benefits do not end with the first initial approval, but you can also use CRP for post-approval changes, particularly variations. So it means that a product that was approved via CRP by one country, if the company wish to provide also the assessment reports of the variations from the SRA for that product, then they can using CRP, and the country will be able to apply reliance also to the assessment reports of the variations. And for that, it's estimated the reference time of 30 working days for the country then to come up with an outcome of the variation assessment. My next slide, please. So these are the two guidelines. They are published in our website about CRP. So the CRP for pre-qualified products and the CRP for products approved by SRA. So you can go through them and you will see step by step how it works, what are the requirements, and also all the templates, for example, the expression of interest template and so on. So you as a company, you don't need to start from the scratch. You have already all the templates and information available in these guidelines. My next slide, please. And now for PQ-CRP, I just wanted to show you some numbers. My next slide, please. This one actually shows the number of countries that are currently participating in PQ-CRP. So CRP for pre-qualified products. We have at the moment 62 participating countries, plus one regional economic community, which is CARICOM, and it covers 15 member states in the Caribbean region. And all those countries you see in red are those that recently joined. If you also see in this list, the majority are actually African countries that are benefiting from CRP. My next slide. And you can go until the end. I think one more. Yes, perfect. Oh, yes, thank you. So in terms of numbers, just to give you some data, PQ-CRP, so far the median number of days utilized by countries to approve a product using PQ-CRP has been 90 working days. And at the moment, we already had more than 1,000 product submissions made through PQ-CRP for more than 300 medical products, for which about 800 registrations have been granted. Next slide, please. And my next slide. So in terms of now SRA CRP and what's the list of SRAs? So the list of stringent regulatory authorities has been defined in the WHO guidelines website. You can find it in there. So the list is vast, and what it means is that any product, as far as it has been approved by one of these countries or regional authorities such as the EMA, is eligible to be submitted through SRA CRP. So I will not go through all the countries, but please take note that any product, as far as it has been approved by one of these countries, is eligible to be submitted via SRA CRP with no restrictions or limitations in terms of therapeutic areas. Next slide, thank you. In terms of participating countries, once again, the list is vast. The majority are also in the African region. And we have at the moment for SRA CRP 53 participating countries plus one regional economic community. Next slide. And also just to give you some data, so at the moment the SRA CRP is more recent than PQ-CRP. PQ-CRP is with us for more than 10 years already. SRA CRP has about 4 years of full implementation. In terms of a number of product submissions, we are now actually close to 250 product submissions made through SRA CRP for more than 50 medical products. And so far, about 150 registrations have been granted by countries. And as you can see, in terms of therapeutic areas, it's very vast. It can go from medicines to vaccines of any type or any therapeutic area. Next slide, please.
I'm Mariana, sorry to interrupt. If you can
wrap up.
Yes. Yeah, thank you.
I'm very close to that. Thank you. If you can go just to my next slide, just to show, so there is some win-wins for both sides, authorities and applicants. We conducted a project evaluation where a lot of interesting findings can be found. This has been published in an article that I will show to you, so you can actually see the outcomes of this project evaluation that was conducted. But in a nutshell, it was identified a list of advantage for companies in terms of reducing the number of duplicated national GMP inspections or laboratory testing prior registration, or advantage such as the fact that companies only need to make one product dossier that is submitted to multiple countries, the savings in terms of resources, time, and obviously the appealing timelines. They were also part of this reported advantage by companies. For authorities, my next slide, please. The main finding that I want to highlight is that the majority of the authorities reported that with the use of CRP, the number of days for registration of products reduced to more than 180 days less when compared to a national procedure outside CRP. Next slide, please. And so this is the article I was mentioning. You can, I think the slides will be shared. So in this article, you'll find all the findings related to this project evaluation on CRP that was conducted. And I think my final slides. So about the also joint assessments, I will not extend myself very much because I know there will be more presentations about that. So I just wanted to emphasize there are initiatives of joint assessments worldwide. And in Africa in particular, 5 out of the 8 regional economic communities have implemented joint assessment programs, and they have joint assessment initiatives. And these are EAC, ECOWAS, IGAD, OSEAC, and SADC through Zazibona. We are supporting some of them as part of our WHO support, and I think you will be hearing more about at least 3 of them in the next presentation. And my final slide, I will bring some final key message at the end, so I will not extend myself. I just wanted to emphasize that indeed facilitated registration pathways such as CRP, joint assessments, or any other reliance tool, they are extremely helpful not only to authorities at lower maturity levels, but also authorities at higher maturity levels. So they are available at the moment, these tools, to any country and any company. So it's a matter of just making a better use of them and more use of them, so you can all benefit from them as well. So thank you so much, and I pass the floor to you, Navina. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marianne. Such an insightful presentation and great results from WHO. Thank you for sharing all that. Now we will hear from Professor Stuart Walker, founder of the Center for Innovation in Regulatory Science, about some activities that CIRS had in the region. Professor, the floor is yours, and you have 7 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. I want to try and answer the question, how can we simplify the path to efficient national registration of medical products in Africa? Next slide, please. We've been reminded this morning that there are 54 countries in Africa, 5 major regions, but ultimately we're working towards one continental assessment, which Marguerite has outlined for us already this morning. Next slide, please. My 3 key messages are, first of all, the African Medicines Agency has to be our ultimate goal for simplifying the path to efficient regulatory registration. Secondly, I want to look briefly at the regional initiatives that we have evaluated, which has been alluded to. And thirdly, the importance of reliance and the study that we completed in 21 African agencies. Next slide. To answer the first message, Marguerite has outlined for us how the African Medicines Agency, we hope, in speedier access to medicines and vaccines for people throughout the continent. She pointed out in one of her previous presentations that this ultimately will improve local production. It will introduce centers of excellence for research, and also it will help against the fight against falsified medicines, which is a major problem in the African continent. Next slide. The reason that I feel privileged to have the opportunity of presenting today in the few minutes allowed to me is that the CIRS Opera tool, which evaluates regulatory authorities and looks at regulatory capacity in Africa, we've been able to evaluate 21 agencies as illustrated in this particular slide. Secondly, we've developed and validated a questionnaire called the Process Effectiveness and Efficiency Rating Scale, where we have been able to evaluate Zazibona, the East Africa Community Initiative, and the ECOWAS, 3 of the major regional initiatives in Africa. And we've been able to look at that both from the perspective of the agencies, what they believe are important, what they think are the strengths and the weaknesses and the opportunities, but also we evaluated the pharma industry's approach to these three regional initiatives. Next slide. So my next three slides are going to demonstrate, first of all, what are the strengths of these three regional initiatives? You can see quite easily the green is the EAC, the blue is Zazibona, and the yellow is the ECOWAS region. So these are the three major regions which ultimately will contribute towards the African Medicines Agency. What are the strengths according to the agencies? Building capacity, which is key, as we've already heard, with so many not having that capacity for assessments. Information sharing amongst regulators, which is something I think we would all support, and the harmonization of registration requirements across the region. However, they would also hope for shorter timelines for approval and clear operating model. Next slide, please. However, whilst there are strengths, there are also weaknesses, and the lack of a centralized submission and tracking system is one of the major challenges and weaknesses of these regulatory systems. Secondly, the fact that they are dependent on the country's process for communication with applicants and experts, and they lack obviously the resources and the lack of the jurisdiction power, because as we know, these three initiatives currently will make recommendations, but they are not mandated, as would be the situation in a centralized situation. There's also unequal workload amongst the member companies and a lack, obviously, they suggest, of detailed information on the process for applicants. Next slide. We've also looked, and this is just an overall summary of the challenges faced by the pharma industry. They believe, from many of the agencies that have been involved in this, that the pharma industry believe that sometimes the local regulatory initiative by the region is more stringent than some regulatory processes in the countries. They also suggest that they have a problem with the different labeling requirements that ultimately result from the participating countries, and the lack of information on the website, and the lack of clarity about the submission and the follow-up, and also the delays that often happen once the recommendation is made, when the local countries take inordinate amount of time to actually then register the product. Next slide. So I want to move now from that idea to the focus on the importance of reliance. And we're very familiar, those of us who work in this region, and I've been working in Africa for many, many years, that national regulatory authorities are under mounting pressure to not only improve performance and facilitate the timely access to safe and effective medicines to patients, but the task is becoming even more challenging in this 21st century due to globalization, increasing complex technologies, and also, not least, but the growing public expectations. So my next slide says that if we want to look at reliance in the region, this is the study that we've conducted amongst 21 African agencies from those three major regions. We identified through a questionnaire which risk-based models the agencies have been using. Secondly, what frameworks they believe they have in place to enable a risk-based approach. And lastly, what do they think is the future direction for risk-based models, and how, this is most important, how can these support the African Medicines Agency? Next slide. So the question was, what type of unilateral reliance model is your agency employing? And here you can see from the 21 agencies, majority are using abridged, which I don't need to define, but it's there in the slide. Obviously, a significant number look at verification and recognition, and there are some of these agencies, a third of them, that use actually all three approaches. So they claim that they are doing unilateral reliance strategies. Next slide. What activities and frameworks do they believe are in place? They say they have a legal framework strategy, that sometimes their criteria and guidelines are transparent internally. Sometimes published. They have standard operating procedures. They have an assessment template for the abridged verification and recognition. And that's so important. I'm not going to look at the detailed results from this study, but you can see that there are certain agencies, Ghana, South Africa, Zimbabwe, Ethiopia, Nigeria, that have all of those three in place. Next slide says for which products can a unilateral alliance be, in fact, utilized? And they say virtually everything: generics, chemical entities, biologics, biosimilars, priority essential medicines, and COVID treatments. So this is very important that they have in place their guidelines and their standard operating procedures. The next slide indicates what key incentives and benefits they believe are available if they undertake a unilateral alliance. On the left-hand side, you see that they suggest that it would be effective and efficient use of resources. That's critical, I would suggest. Faster availability of medicines for patients, and that it would build capacity through improved agency knowledge and experience. Because if they are, in fact, utilizing reliance and putting some emphasis and reliance on stringent regulatory authorities, they can learn from those authorities. But I also want to mention the last two, which is one, quality of decision-making they claim is improved if they use reliance, and the importance of alignment of technical guidelines and registration processes across the three regions. But I want you to note that whilst they claim that these are the key incentives and benefits, if you look on the right-hand side, you see that very often these are not being measured. And if you want to, in fact, move an agency to ML3, then you have to demonstrate that these things are measured and monitored. That is extremely important, to have evidence-based information for those particular suggestions of incentives and benefits. Next slide. It merely shows a couple of publications. Next slide, please. Just a couple of publications, because I had to go through this very quickly in my 7 minutes that were allowed. And you can see that you can look at a book called Work Sharing Initiatives in Africa, and also the Roadmap for Regulatory Performance. And if you like to write to me, I will be willing to send those to you electronically. So I move now towards my final comments. Next slide. We need
just to ask you to wrap up, Professor.
I will. Absolutely, 1 minute. So what are the improvements? Next slide. The recommendations from this CIRS study are, first of all, alignment the operating models to improve efficiency. Secondly, to have a legal framework that would allow for the establishment of a centralized procedure. Thirdly, and this was raised at the Rwanda meeting that I was at and spoke at just literally last month, the importance of information management systems that in fact will rectify the challenges that we've identified in this study and allow for the tracking and monitoring of performance. Last but by no means least is the whole area of reliance. This should support the strengthening of capacity of the member states, and it will allow the using of the WHO global benchmarking tool assessments to facilitate not only inter-country, but inter-rec reliance. And so in conclusion, my last slide, but one, the results of these comparisons allow for 3 regional harmonizations initiatives to learn from each other. Secondly, the implementations of these recommendations will bring about a greater alignment and efficiency in these operating models, strengthening the foundation of the soon-to-be operationalized African Medicines Agency. And for your information, the Center for Innovation in Regulatory Science has developed a number of tools that are linked to the WHO GBT indicators and have been shown to be of value to agencies and regions who wish to assess their regulatory performance when supporting the African Medicines Agency. Last slide. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. And I believe that I have kept to my time as much as any of the previous speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Walker. A lot of insights indeed, and some good recommendations. With this, I would like to introduce you to our panelists. So we will have today Dr. Sibyl Nana Ama-Osei Agiema-Yeboah from West African Health Organization. Ms. Kristelna Reineke, Chief Operating Officer from South African Health Products Regulatory Authority, Ms. Sekile Dube from South African Development Community, and Dr. John Wangi, Head of Regulatory Affairs for East and West Central Africa and Bayer, and member of IPMA ARN. Thank you very much all for joining us today. So you all have a very difficult task to respond to a couple of questions in a very limited time. I would like us, and maybe if the organizers could move to the next slide, please. I would like us to start with the first two questions. So if you could maybe summarize in the next 2 to 3 minutes, what is your experience regarding facilitated regulatory pathways currently available in the continent, and share a little bit more about the strengths, challenges, opportunities that you've seen in the regional joint assessment procedures during the years, and then also tell us a little bit more how the reliance has been implemented in practice, either on regional recommendations, on CRA assessment, and what works and what would be some opportunities. So maybe I could start with Sekile with this time, if you don't mind. If you could share some thoughts from Zazibona. Thank you.
Okay. I think Stuart kind of stole my thunder a bit because he shared a lot of the advantages and disadvantages. But I think the main important thing would be that Zazibona has managed to stay afloat for 10 years. So I would say that is definitely a strength. Also, it has offered the possibility of registration across 9 countries within the SADC region, and then potentially access to all 16 of those that are within SADC. Then at the same time, I think one of the key things that was important is that initially, especially when we had the 4 and the 5 initial countries, the timelines were brilliant and on point. However, when we look at maybe some of the weaknesses, that's when you see that as the number of participating countries became bigger, and as well as the interest grew, some of the timelines were kind of missed here and there. Then recently as well, another strength is that when we were requested by industry, we then responded by introducing a CRP process for SRA approved products. Zazibona still does not actually do WHO pre-qualified products because we cannot do it faster than what we already have at country level. So the weaknesses, I think Stuart did a good job highlighting those. One thing that didn't come out was our heavy dependence on partner funding. And that's one of the things that we're trying to address at the present moment. We do have a way of sustaining ourselves through the surplus that we make from the joint inspections. But now we're also going to be looking at cost recovery for the assessments as well. Then some of the challenges as well, the perceived more stringent approach. But sometimes that is actually kind of a perception, because what really would be happening is that there's more dexterity at a national level where a country can give waivers. But once you have a combined process, it's not so easy to give the waivers. So sometimes that misinterpretation can actually give the perception that it's more stringent. One of the other major challenges is that whilst we've achieved regulatory harmonization, we still have some way to go in terms of convergence, mainly because a lot of things hinge in the different countries' legislation. So some things cannot be wished away or blown away until the legislation changes. And unfortunately, it's not always within the ambit of the regulator to do those changes. Then do you want me to continue to touch on the reliance issue as well? And then wrap it up. Yes. So the key thing to understand about Zazibona is that it is a work-sharing initiative. So by virtue of that, we only focus on what we do together because of the gaps that are there in the member states. So when something is working well at country level, we don't want to duplicate that effort. So in a sense, we do have that level of reliance that there are CRP processes for SRA as well as for WHO pre-qualified products at country level. So we try not to duplicate that at a continental level, except maybe on a case-by-case basis. Then a new development, slightly stretching off where the recommendation, because there's been a lot of complaints that our output was a recommendation and not a registration. So there were challenges with how those recommendations were finalized, timeline differences, additional queries being raised, and so on. We're happy to announce that we are moving towards a pilot that will look wholly at trying to have reliance on that recommendation. So on that sweet note, I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sakila. Maybe I can hand over to Dr. Sibyl next to share a bit of ECOWAS perspectives.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I think the region and as well as the continent, we all have a common focus. And then from Margaret's submission, you see that the AMRH actually had planned for the continent for which all the regs were roped in. So in the preparation, and then by the 2015, the region, the ECOWAS region had actually been ready. Before then, we had to address, in terms of developing our strength, had to address two groupings within the region as an umbrella, and then another subgroup called the URUMWA. We have to really bridge to understand one another, to be able to align ourselves. So that discussion went on for a while. In 2014, we were able to break the ice, and therefore the development of trust and confidence created. In 2015, we became one ECOWAS region in terms of the joint assessment practices. So we were able to finalize our common technical documents and all the guidelines and procedures. We were able to form a common steering committee, and then the expert working groups. Initially, we had 7 of them. And then most of them were coming from different countries, joining the expert working groups to work in terms of the registration, inspection, and all the various areas of capacity that we needed to pave the way forward. So that actually created the trust and confidence and understanding, and of course, reliance among ourselves. So we were able to move forward fast in that way. So that actually looked at this as strength. In terms of challenges, because we didn't have enough funding from the beginning, we had a little World Bank funding. We used some to build capacities within the countries to be able to get the expertise and then to get the country systems going, infrastructure going. So we have very little funds. So we had to sustain the process, we have to charge, from our region, take some money from the applicant. So we realized that it did not look, comparative to the other region, didn't look too attractive to them. So we're getting applications. But if you look at what Margaret said, after now we have 28 applications. It looks like, oh, you're charging. But in reality, the amount that we charge wasn't registration alone, it was registration, GMP assessment, as well as quality control if needed, well inclusive, charging 8,000, 10,000, depending on where you're coming from, and 12,000. So that was the initial challenge, but we needed to sustain the process. So that was what didn't bring in so much application initially. So that has been it. But we tried to address, we had a lot of seminars with the manufacturers, we've had the webinars, we've done a lot of, developed the infographics thanks to International Federation of Manufacturers. We've also looked at, reducing the number of samples that needs to be collected at a country level if they have to apply on the joint assessment procedures and all that to make it more attractive and engaging more of the manufacturers, as well. So we're looking forward to see an increase in the numbers. Then opportunities has been that we have been able to do a lot of trainings and then a lot of trainings, and we believe that as we move forward, and we would see more development coming, because to increase the technology as well as the health infrastructures, we've done a web portal, we've actually put on an ECTD to make things faster for both the regulators as well as the applicants. And then these are the way forward in ensuring that such opportunities will rather help us to strengthen, our capacities as well. So thank you so much. This is the infographics that actually has helped us, and it talks about the whole pathway of which we go in, the the evolving of 15 countries, as well as the procedures. So you have the slides. I won't speak to it too much. And then the pathway to go. If you apply and have a full dossier, I mean, a quality dossier, within 66 days, you should have your products going through, especially if it has gone through the WHO processor PQ, the EMA processes, as well as the FDA and all that. And then you bring the full dossier, not a summary. Some normally bring summaries, and it means you have to go through the long process. But if you bring a full dossier, if you read the first application, you have proof for 66 days. If you don't, then the queries go on. And then if you do just one response to the queries, 139 days. And then if you don't, you have to go to the second query sample, and then you go to the 182 days. So that it depends on the applicant. The speed depends on the applicant and the way forward. So that is how, we looked at about 8 to 9 processes in terms of scope of products. The essential drug list, we have the program medicines, the public health emerging medicines, the WHO PQ and EMA, and the registration, life savings, biological products, and then WAHO listed product, which becomes essential during emergencies and other areas, and then also the priority medical supplies and other things. So in summary, this is what I want to project as to the procedure. Now, having the message, it means that we have to bring all stakeholders together, which we normally work on. We have both the regulators, the manufacturers, the procurers, as well as the partners and donors, and then which are technical and financial partners. The RECs, we've been engaging SADC, EAC, and the rest, and of course, global, WHO, and Swedmedics, and EMA, and other global entities, especially IPMF, International Manufacturers Association, and so that we can all bring our minds together. Highly interactive environments, which would enhance the regulatory ecosystem in the region, is one area that the ECOWAS system actually works on. We also look at the fact that we need to do management and policy guidelines and guidances, and that we need to move just in registration, but to engaging the procurers as well as national level. Recently, we engaged them, which is 2022, and then this year as well, to come out with the pool procurement system that will help us to link registration and approved products into the real market, so that patients are able to assess the products as the quality product as needed. So we've done engagement. We've actually gone to ways of getting resources, which we engage with partners, as well as also the quality assurance framework, which has been developed so far. So in technology and information management system was very, very relevant. So we have actually on the web portal of the medicine vaccines, which has also been completed, we developed the electronic ECTD, which we met just about 2 weeks ago in Accra, to give the countries, they've been part of the process for the past year, but then to give them access to it to practice more, and then also be able to use that site, which we'll do for both region and all the 15 countries, so that application can be received faster, and then we can move forward to engage. So in reality, this is the way forward for the region in a snapshot, and then we think that we'll be able to go through successfully. So in our engagement with seeing to reliance, and then the importance of the process, it is one key thing that we take into consideration. And then we also acknowledge collaboration and reliance mechanism. SADC would bear in mind, EAC would bear in mind that we all try to collaborate with all stakeholders, and then rely on information that is coming from the RECs as well, and within. And because of the trust we built, some of the countries have done also mutual recognition in terms of relying on one another, like 2 countries having an MOU with one strong countries like Ghana and other countries, so that they can take products that have been registered to move fast if an application comes on. So apart from the centralized regional processes, the countries themselves are also engaging among themselves to be able to also work, within, apart from. So we have the 3-tier processes going on currently within the region. And the opportunities and the way forward for AMA, and then of course the other process that, like I always say on any platform, that the regs are the pillars of AMA. So whatever the regs are doing, we are building a strong pillar for AMA to stand on, so that it can materialize its goals or objectives in the best way forward. So definitely that efficiency is needed for all the regs to be able to stand. And of course, it's apart from supporting the continent AMA, we also work and support the national registration process. Because for our process, we give recommendation as the countries that give the market authorization at country level, as the countries that give the heads of the NMRs and the steering committee that approve the products, they take decision. So the countries are part and parcel of the whole process, and they register.
Thank you, Dr. Sibyl. Thank you very much.
I want to say thank you for accepting ECOWAS, supporting us in this. Thank you.
Thank you
I was
very
not
much.
too fast.
Thank you.
To make time.
Yes, thanks a lot. So I think we can now hand over to Kristelna. So from the perspective of the National Regulatory Authority, and SAPER has also a number of pathways established in previous years as national ones. How do you see the facilitated regulatory pathways, and what are some learnings from your side? Would you like to share with us?
Thanks, Nabila. I actually think the two colleagues have covered these two topics in quite a bit of detail. So I think maybe other than just repeating what Dave just said, I think some key reflections from my side, just listening to them and also just the presentations, tapping into our experience and how we've I suppose navigated the process of the different regulatory review pathways, as well as the collaborative review process. Some of the key things I think that even for us, internally that sticks out, which we feel needs a little bit more attention as we continue to evolve and this whole process continues to mature. We spoke now, and it's very interesting, I think in ECOWAS, that they talk about having a common electronic platform, which I think for us is quite a key thing to progress, I suppose, the work that is happening within the SADC region. So specifically having a digital platform, because I think even as we tackle that topic a bit later this week, that becomes quite important, right? So it enables then, I think, colleagues from different geographical areas to much certainly also, to I think just manage the automated workflows and specifically tracking, progress of these applications. Because I think the one element that we touched on earlier, I think the opening speaker touched on this in terms of, it's not just about enabling access, but also enabling access in a timely manner. So definitely for me, I think one of the key takeaways that we are looking at the moment is just in terms of the common electronic or digital platforms, specifically linked to that within the region, also a move towards not just CTD, but actually ECTD submissions that very much ties in with that. The other thought I think that kind of came up in as much as we've got these progress made in terms of having MOUs in place with other regulatory authorities. Two things really, maybe just to put out for perhaps some reflection and further discussion from all of the participants. The one thing being, in as much as we have got MOUs in place and we talk about having trust in the respective work that each other or the other party is doing, I think there is still, I suppose, on the ground where the rubber hits the road, if you will, there is still sometimes at a technical level some hesitation, and I think one way that we really feel this can be breached or eliminated actually altogether is specifically the implementation of the WHO's competency framework. We see this as being quite a game changer. That when you look at a specific dossier, that you would have the same approach, you would pick up on the same things. Certainly not to say that it must be prescriptive and say you must only look at these things, you must only highlight these issues. But certainly, I think then in terms of the reproducing a expected result, doesn't matter where you do the evaluation or in which country, that you would expect to have the same outcomes, you would have the same recommendations, and as such, the level of ease of referring then on each other, referring to each other and relying on each other's work will just become infinitely more and more easy as this competency framework gets, I think, more entrenched and more adopted across various regions. The other, I think, topic also, and I mean, this has been touched on, so I don't want to belabor the point, but one key thing for us to have greater collaboration or greater success with the collaborative review process is also having then enabling legislative frameworks across the different countries. And I mean, yes, I think I do acknowledge that it's not always within the ambit of the regulator to change that and say, this is how we now want to do it. But I think certainly we must continue to drive that. So even the legislative environment allows us to more easily rely on each other's work. And even where we then get to things like public assessment reports and these becoming available to more easily share information across the territories. So I think that probably just some of the reflections I would like to put out and share with the rest of the group. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Christelle. Quite extensive intervention. Thanks a lot. So I think I can move now to Dr. John Mwangi. John, would you like to share some industry perspectives on maybe all 3 points raised here in the questions?
Sure, and thank you. Again, it is also really nice to come to this discussion and see.
John, sorry, it's cutting a little bit. Can you just please move to the microphone closer?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, now it's good.
Okay. Now, I was saying it is very good to see the meeting of minds between all these colleagues from the regulatory space. And now speaking like the consumer for all these systems that are in place, I would like, first of all, to share the perspectives from some of the regional economic community work as well as the WHO CRP, because we see a lot of value in this as far as industry is concerned. One of the first thing for consideration is actually the timelines. And I know it's an easy word to say that timelines are shortening, but we have consistently seen that the timelines that it's taking, especially to bring new drugs to market, and not only time to get approval, secondary to that, also between the lead countries, let's say the SRA countries, the timelines that it's now to have new therapies in, let's say, African countries. And I think that's a good thing because it's also enabling patients in Africa to get the drugs a bit ahead of schedule.
You're continually breaking up. It's difficult.
We can't hear. It's really breaking all the time.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, it's better.
A mistake, yeah. Sorry for that. The second point I wanted to drive across is actually better control of the markets, and I hope now you can hear me better. Nivina?
Yes, we can. Yes.
All right, great. Sorry for that. Better control of the markets. We are seeing now markets which previously, 4 or 5 years ago, didn't have any set of regulation, have actually now well developed, courtesy of also working through the regions and following reliance practices. And now it's possible to introduce products in this market, knowing very well that there's very good level of control there. Then we also see, as one of the colleagues has also indicated, that utilization of reliance practices, use of the regional economic community procedures has actually proven to be a very good proof of concept as far as Africa Medicines Agency is concerned. Now we are halfway there, sure that this can be done because we have seen it demonstrated. We have seen people working together. I think levels of trust can also be measured by such aspects as we are seeing here. We have examples of health authorities actually sharing IT platforms or the prototype from one health authority going to another. And by this, then it means that the health authorities don't have to start from scratch, and there's a spillover effect, positive to that extent, to the industry. We also see high degree of prediction because we can track the calendar of events, we can track the calendar of evaluation, and with that, then we're also able to plan better. Having the same dossier, for instance, is also making it much easier to ease the supply of products because most of the markets in the past were very fragmented. And so having a different dossier for each market has not worked very well. Today, it's possible to have one dossier which is going to various markets, and this has made it very easy for product supply to also be very efficient. On the other hand, we have areas of opportunities to make improvements. One of them, and I think it has been highlighted already, is the link between national and regional. I think we still have to do a lot as far as this is concerned because we faced a lot of disconnect here. And in the past, we have faced delays, which could come close to even 6 months, 9 months, simply because there is no clarity at the national level on what needs to happen once there is a regional assessment that has produced a positive assessment report. So that's something we need to really look at. The other thing, of course, is, well, as we have a lot of guidelines now, and this is a very welcome move, we are also yet to see that we are living to the spirit of what these guidelines are saying. So if we think about, for instance, WHO CRP experience that we face in some of the countries, there's still a bit of a disconnect between the understanding in the country, the focal person, the coordination at the country level, and what is actually expected between WHO and SRA. When you think about the practice of reliance as well, we can say that we are making very good strides, but it's still, of course, an area of improvement that we need, especially when you think about the national requirements. You know, it is not still unusual to find a request to certify an ECPP and go ahead as well and legalize it. And that obviously defeats the purpose of why we have come this far to also have documents such as ECPPs, which ideally would be a good enabler for reliance practices. Then we see a lot of variability also in and between countries on how reliance is treated. So it's not unusual that in one drug product, reliance practices are applied which are different from, let's say, an interpretation compared to another drug product, depending on the time and the health authority where this is applied. Of course, it takes time to get there, but it is important to also see that that is an area of opportunity. One other thing that I would also like to highlight is it is very important that all these discussions we are having here, that we take a holistic approach. I'm very happy to hear, especially from the presentation from WHO, that there is really the need to include, for instance, post-approval changes in everything that we're discussing today, especially when it comes to use of reliance practices and use of joint assessment. Because, like I said, one of the advantage is actually to have one dossier. And if we divert from it because we are not able to handle the post-approval changes in a harmonized way, then of course it's not a good thing. So even I want to stop there momentarily, and then I can come back to answer the last question after you have.
Thank you very much, John. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. We have quite a limited time left. So I see, Christella, you raise your hand. Is there something you would like to share further, or we can
Yeah, Navina, thanks. I mean, I was just listening to the last reflections now, and one thing that maybe struck me, just if I reflect now on everybody's input, I wonder what it would take for African regulators, and specifically I think it's 5 African regulators that now are at ML3. What is the catalyst? What would it take for these 5 regulatory authorities to actually create a reliance review mechanism very similar to what we see with the Access Consortium between Canada, Singapore, Switzerland, UK, and Australia? We've got 5 very strong regulators, 5 regulators that are at ML3. What more is needed for us to move to a next stage where we say that between these 5 regulators, we should have some sort of an access consortium for Africa? I think for me that certainly is an exciting, I suppose, prospect, and maybe something. Hopefully, I can plant a seed and it can take roots and germinate very nicely with some of the other African regulatory colleagues that's on the conference and on the call today. Hopefully, this is something we can actually take outside of the session and discuss in a lot more detail, and try and see if we can, start a fire where there is currently a little bit of smoke. Thanks.
I think that would be an excellent suggestion, I have to say. And as we've worked with all 5 regional operations, we would be happy to help and support where we could in that particular issue. Thanks
a lot, Christella. Really great idea. And yeah, from industry side, of course, I mean, if you're planning some pilots, or we can suggest any experiences from Access or other pathways, that would be also helpful. So, Dr. Sibyl, we have literally 6 minutes, and we got 5 minutes additional from the next session. So, please, if you can have your short intervention.
Yeah, I'm just backing what Christiana said, and I think from experience, we should not leave the countries alone to struggle to try to strengthen the regulatory system, but should also be a responsibility of the regs. And I think for ECOWAS, that was where they are, or to get to where they are, and others are moving forward to that status. So we need to do that. And I agree to the fact that the 5 that have already been established on the continent to be put into a consortium or somewhere, because then they can also have the rest and the capacity and move forward with that. So thank you.
Thank you.
Then not that alone, we should also be able to monitor the industries, the manufacturing industries, to also comply with all the regulations.
Thank you. John, some final thoughts from your side?
Very quickly. One of them, like I said, to emphasize the role clarity. I think we don't want to be bumping on national, regional, continental every now and then. I think we need to get that very clear. Then we really need to advance reliance. Not only now consider reliance, but advance it. And I think we should consider some enablers, such as public. We've seen some good thing to start working. Another enabler that we should work on is yes, maybe.
The audio is really breaking a lot. I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry for that. And then, can you hear me now?
Faintly, yes, a bit better.
Okay. And finally, I also wanted to really speak about the digitalization piece, because we see a big correlation and a good one between better outcomes, where you have health authorities which are highly digitalized in the African continent with good platforms and which are very transparent as far as filing and following up on applications are concerned. And finally, we still need to collaborate a lot, communicate, and identify synergies. We as ARN here have been doing a lot in that, such as making the infographics. I think we've just seen one for ECOWAS, and there are several others available. as well as some of the opinion pieces and published articles that everyone could see online. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, John. So thank you again to all the speakers and panelists. I think we can move to the conclusion now. It was really insightful discussion, I have to say, and we summarized some of the points here. You will all receive the slides, and I hope you will have the chance to continue the discussion also following this session, because we opened a lot of questions here. Some key takeaways from this session are that we see a lot of positive aspects from this collaborative procedures and regional joint assessments, such as shorter timelines and the flexibility to extend the process to some products. But what is still important is to clarify the scope and the responsibilities of all the layers that we have in the continent. So we have national, which is very important, because at the end of the day, they are the final decision makers on what comes to their countries. But we also have regional, and we will have soon continental. So we really need to strive avoiding redundancy and duplication and having clarity around the scope and roles and responsibilities in all three layers. Appropriate regional provision of official guidances and procedures needs to be implemented in the national regulations. We've heard from multiple speakers that this legal provision is really very important. If you move to the next slide, we summarized some of the points, what industry thinks, but I believe this is really a common understanding from all of us here, how we can collectively work together to improve some areas of those procedures. So I'm going to leave it here because you have the link also in the slides, and you can read into more details, and I think all those points have been already made. And the next one, if you move further, we also heard some encouraging messages around development. So we've heard that SADC is really working very diligently to address some of the points that you raised, such as inclusion of post-approval changes in their scope as well, and also addressing sustainability issues, such as also EAC and some other regions. We've heard a lot of pilot projects that are under development, so we want really to praise that and to encourage early involvement of all stakeholders. And we've heard also from Margaret in the beginning that there is a lot going on the continental technical working groups. So we're really looking forward to hear and see the publication of the guidelines that are being developed. From industry side, we are continuing to be committed to continue the raising the awareness, making more engaged in all the discussions, and also to motivate our members to use those procedures more systematically, because only with that, with utilizing that and learning, having both positive and less positive experiences, we could jointly improve them and work towards the benefits of all the stakeholders in the continent. So with this, thanks a lot for all your participation today, for all the engagement, and I'm looking forward to continue working with all of you together with continuous efforts and joint forces to improve lives of the patients in Africa. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Nevena. And with that, we will transition to session 2. Unfortunately, we won't have time for a break. We're a bit over time. But thanks everyone for participating. I hope you stay for the second part of today's session. You may go ahead, Kelly.
Hello, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Thank you so much for joining us for this session that I have the privilege to moderate. So this is a session on clinical trials and research ecosystem in Africa, optimization for the future. I am the moderator for this session, and what I will do, I'll kick off and just give a very brief introduction and a background to myself, and then spell out the objectives of this session. So as you may have already picked up, my name is Kelly Chibale, and I am based at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. where I hold the Nevo Isdale Chair in African-centric drug discovery and development, and also direct our drug discovery center known as H3D, which has a partnership with the H3D Foundation and the IFPMA to build capacity and capabilities in Africa in drug discovery and related sciences. I previously was a board member of SAPRA, which is our local regulator here in South Africa. And I had the privilege back in 2019 to give a keynote address at the 4th scientific conference on medical products regulation, which was held at the Victoria Falls in Zimbabwe. And there I was asked to articulate what, to me, as an R&D scientist, what the harmonization of the regulatory environment meant within the context of clinical trials, which of course obviously have a bearing on, have health implications for obvious reasons, but also something we don't often talk about is the business implications of clinical trials. It's creating jobs when there's a clinical trials. It's attracting foreign direct investment. And of course, it's building infrastructure that can be repurposed for many other clinical trial in other therapeutic areas as well. But back to the focus of this particular session, we have 3 main objectives for this session. The first one is really around the World Health Assembly Resolution 75.8, which I'm going to read to you. So this resolution is really around strengthening clinical trials to provide high quality evidence on health interventions and to improve research quality and coordination. So the first objective for this session is to explore what the endorsement of this particular resolution means for Africa. How can implementation of this resolution help facilitate efficient clinical research on the African continent? So that's the first objective. The second objective is to iterate the continued importance of convergence and harmonization and system strengthening for clinical research in Africa. So the question is, how do we get to a point where countries in Africa look holistically at the clinical research ecosystem in terms of harmonization, in terms of priorities, in terms of prerequisites, ethics, etc., as we'll find out from this session. Finally, but not least, the third objective for this session is to provide an understanding of what are the roles and responsibilities of the different stakeholders for which this is extremely relevant and important. So there are 5 distinguished guests as part of this panel, and you get to know them as we go along. I will not go through the biographies of the panelists and the speakers, but you can see these on the IFPMA website for details of the speakers as they come up. The session is divided into 3 main parts. We're going to kick off with a scene setting component where we have 2 presentations, and I'll come back to those in a second. That then will be followed by a moderated panel discussion with 3 of the 5 guests representing different stakeholders. And then we'll have a moderated Q&A and then a final wrap up in terms of takeaways from this session. So the first part of this session is a scene setting session, and we have 2 presentations. The first one will be given by Vasi Muthi from the World Health Organization. And then we'll move directly after Vasi to Thomas Nyirenda from EDCTP, who will also provide a scene setting presentation in terms of the clinical research and clinical trial landscape on the African continents. without further ado, I'm going to invite Vasi to kick us off and give us the latest activities related to this resolution from the WHO perspective. Vasi, over to you.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, loud and clear.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Chibala, and thank you to IFPMA for the invitation. This is such an important discussion, and the private sector and the regulatory authorities are so central to all of this work. So can we have the next slide? What I would broadly like to do with this sort of scene setting is explain why there is a World Health Assembly resolution that has been adopted by all of the member states that we have at WHO, 195, and why this is relevant to Africa. So the background is that there are some really good examples of both private sector and publicly coordinated trials that were absolutely critical for policy and practice during the pandemic. And this is an example where we have strong recommendations either in favor or against for particular agents, which means that we have high certainty of the evidence from good trials. But these were really only a very small proportion of the trials that were done. And the next slide, but it's very good that we have good examples to work from. There were very many poor quality trials. In this US FDA publication, the last author is Janet Woodcock from the US FDA. They gave one estimate of 95% of trial arms were not either not randomized or were not adequately powered. So there is a problem, and this problem is not specific by any means to any one group of countries. I mean, this is related to high-income countries, middle-income countries, and low-income countries. By contrast, the biggest gaps in capacities for clinical trials do tend to be focused in certain settings. So I think we need to distinguish the need to dramatically support clinical trial capacity development in areas where they are needed. And some parts of Africa certainly would be part of that. Although there are really very substantial clinical trial capacities in some parts of Africa now, thanks to investments over the last few decades. And then a separate issue that is raised in the resolution is beyond capacity development, the need to have more efficient ways of trying to ensure that the trials are fit for purpose. They're good quality design and they produce information that can be used for both regulatory and policy decision making. Next slide. So this is, in a nutshell, the problem statement underlying the resolution. It's really worth reading the text of the resolution because it goes into some detail already on suggested actions by different stakeholders that they can take to improve quality and coordination. A lot of focus on what are well-designed and well-implemented clinical trials. The scope is across all different disease areas, and really the focus is on how can we develop functional capacities that can be used all of the time and are available to be pivoted to emergencies. We saw that a lot of the most useful capacities for trials in the pandemic were not necessarily those in emerging infectious disease networks, but they were those that had been set up, for example, for HIV, TB, and malaria, and other diseases, non-communicable diseases too, which could then pivot. Next slide. We have 3 sets of activities that are underway. There is a high-level guidance, and I won't spend much time on this, but just please be aware that there is a public consultation. We have just extended the deadline on request from several groups by 7 days. So it's actually September the 22nd. So there is an opportunity for you to look at what we are putting out there as the first draft of best practices for clinical trials across all disease areas. And we really like you to look at what we're proposing and suggest improvements. We then, on the right-hand side, have a number of consultations, including with many, many different stakeholder groups. And IFPMA organized their own side event on the sides of WHA, but we have many others, including 4 in-person meetings, including one in Afro. That's going to be in Zambia, one in Brasilia, one in Cairo, and one in Delhi, where we're going into some detail to try and receive from countries what their key barriers and areas of focus are that they see they would like improvements in the ecosystem. And we're also looking into more detail what can be done to provide global visualizations of the current status of the global clinical trials ecosystem around networks, funding, national regulations, and all of the institutional capacities. Next slide. This is, oh, go back, please. Oh, no, sorry, one forward, yes. So this is, I don't have time to go through this, but I think these slides are going to be shared. And it's just to say that in the feedback that we receive from different groups, these sorts of issues, and I don't have time to go through them, come up. And depending on maybe who you are, what group you're from, one or two of these might be most pertinent to you, but all of them are really very important. And so, if I had a longer period, and I might maybe go into this later in the panel, but there are certain areas where actions are needed and can be taken, practical steps can be taken to maybe remove some of the barriers and move more into an enabling, efficient mode. Next slide. This is just one slide I have on an actual example of a trial, which makes it very concrete, where it's not as simple as this, but there are, broadly speaking, two sets of clinical trials. One, very, very important for novel interventions to seek marketing authorization or licensure, and another where we're broadly dealing with interventions which have already been licensed or are not medical product interventions like behavioral interventions, where the real issue is shifting policy. This one more falls into the latter, where we had an evidence gap and there was no recommendation to use this type of medicine for this indication, preterm infant mortality reduction in developing countries. And so a group came together, all sorts of different stakeholders, organized a trial in 4 countries in Africa and Asia, and generated really compelling evidence from one trial that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine that rapidly led to updating of the WHO guidelines and a very strong recommendation for use of this intervention in this setting, which then has no doubt led to saving many lives. So that's just a practical example of how clinical trials, if done well, can change policy and practice and can save many lives. Next slide. And another good practice that we have identified, and I think we have some of the AVREF Secretariat on the line, is this African Vaccines Regulatory Forum. It's a bit of a misnomer because it's not restricted to vaccines anymore. It's possible to apply related to medicines. And this is an example of joint regulatory and ethics review for clinical trial authorization. And we really think that there's scope for more to be done along these lines of coordination between regulatory and ethics authorities and looking at streamlining and shortening timelines of review. Interagency coordination and streamlining is one of the focuses of the guidance that we have put out. Next slide. We then just did a very preliminary stage of some mapping where we're kind of interrogating whatever global databases we have just to see if we can get more information and make it publicly available. I guess the large private sector companies probably have their own internal databases that they use, but we also think it could be helpful, and we were requested by the resolution to see what more we can provide. This is just one example of when we look at the disease classifications. You see that infectious diseases are important everywhere, but actually cancer is the main topic of clinical trials in, I guess, regions of the world where there are more high-income countries. Whereas in the Southeast Asian region, in the Eastern Mediterranean region, and in the African region, actually the #1 topic of clinical trials is infectious diseases. But you can also see a big difference in the numbers of clinical trials by region. Next slide. And then just nearly finishing, we also were asked to look into what is the status of clinical trials legislation, and we've identified 138 countries where we've been able to extract some information on their legislation and guidance status. And in the next slide, and when we clean this, we're going to make it publicly available, though we won't be naming the countries here. There are, as you'd hope, almost all of these countries have requirements that informed consent, regulatory approval, and ethical oversight is obtained. I mean, we would like to see that at 100%, but it's quite good. It's a little bit further behind in the requirement that clinical trials are registered. But this already gives you an idea that can be used as a baseline. And there are also other mappings that we have underway of research institutions, as far as we can go at a global level, and sponsoring entities. although Shingai might mention a more detailed database that exists in Africa called ctc.africa. We have identified whatever we can at the global level, and we're planning to make this publicly available later. So I'll stop there. I'm running out of time, although I haven't run over, but just to say that I think that it's a really good time to capitalize on this momentum. And obviously a lot of discussions have been underway before the resolution, but it's a framework where any suggestions for improvements, reforms, efficiencies to the ecosystem, WHO can also play a part in advocating for needed reforms in line with the framing of the resolution for more well-designed and well-implemented trials and greater efficiency in the ecosystem, and of course, greater clinical trial capabilities in all regions of the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Vasi. Appreciate that presentation, and also thank you so much for.
I do need to mention the funding. I nearly forgot. So just to say that we do have specific funding from EDCTP and NIHR in the UK. So sorry, back to you, Professor.
No problem, Vasi. Just as well, because the next speaker is from EDCTP, so it's good to acknowledge them. So we're gonna go straight into Thomas's presentation, which will also be a maximum of 10 minutes, and then we'll come back because both Thomas and Vasi will be part of the Q&A with the other panelists as well. So it's over to you, Thomas. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kelly, and thanks also to PMA from me for inviting me to be part of this very important discussion. And just in opening, I would like to just share my personal idea. And the idea is that I think every regulator should demand that any clinical trial on a disease of global importance should start from Africa. I don't know what my fellow regulators will think about that, but my next slide is the basis for my argument. Next slide, please. Historians, archaeologists, and geneticists all agree, and they teach us that life started in Africa. As you can see from this map, the genetic variation in sub-Saharan Africa particularly is so enormous, such that the migration and dilution as you go out, as humans moved out to other parts, is not as complex as in Africa. If we do clinical trials first in Africa, we could evade these complications we are seeing now, like growing new subjects, like personalized medicine, like it's a separate issue, but it is a clinical research issue, which has been created by just sequestrating trials in areas where they will not make sense when they produce intervention in other parts of the world. Despite all arguments, the picture of the status of clinical trials in Africa, which I've been asked to talk about, to me is a mix of sadness and encouragement. Sadness because the continent that is a house of 20% of the global population harbors 25% of the global burden of disease is only home of 3% of clinical trials. I think such an imbalance is sad reality that needs to be reversed. Sad also because personally myself, for the 19 years I've worked for EDCTP, I constantly hear partners and collaborators, especially those from industry, saying they failed to come and do trials in Africa because of weak scientific and regulatory capacities. This is sad because these are very fixable issues, as I'll show in one of the slides. And together, I think we can make a difference, as many speakers have already said. So if you go to the next slide, this is where the encouragement starts. If you look at the map that our colleagues from CTC, this is the clinical trials community, which is a new program funded by the Gates Foundation, helping us to map the clinical trials and clinical trial capacities in Africa, we are now seeing a good picture of the increase of clinical trials on the continent, probably better than what has been published in ad hoc studies that didn't do in-depth analysis. And this is just from raw data, and there's a lot more data that needs to be analyzed from CTC to give us good pictures about what has been the contribution of Africa in the clinical trials. So here, just portraying the 20 top countries in the last, this is about in the last 17 years, you can see how the clinical research contribution has been. And this is from different registers across the world that softwares are able to pull together, plus input from scientists and sites reporting into the register themselves. This is ongoing work. We can talk about that in a separate subject. But to me, this is very encouraging. Although, if you go to the next slide, please. This is, for Africa, it is still a concern that 90% of that batch of clinical trials is done mainly from two countries, and that's Egypt and South Africa, leaving a lot of disease endemic countries that of relevance, the countries that I call countries left behind, still in an area where they need to participate fully. This is also changing because of several interventions by funders and partners. And I'm going to talk now about the contribution of EDCTP, who are the funding agency that are my employment agency as well. So if you go to the next slide, it shows you what the contribution has been. This is just looking at the last 10 years with as little money as 1 billion euros. I mean, you can see the volume of trials that have been supported. Out of 438 projects, 140 of them have been big collaborative studies. And not just that, the issue of capacities of building networks in the middle of the picture there, and also training of future leaders, what we call fellows and others, etc., who are able to form a force that will stand the test of time in terms of doing clinical trials for many years on sub-Saharan African continent. If you go to the next slide, this just shows you how such a small fund over a small period can cover many of those countries that I talked about as left behind. You can see now with that kind of amount of money, 44 countries receiving funding. That's an enormous amount of participation. And we would want this to increase. And we cannot increase this if we don't further strengthen the regulatory and ethical oversight. Next slide, please. If you want to look at those countries in terms of the volumes, again, you can see South Africa dominates, but nice to see some weak countries like Sudan or Niger participating here and there. But I must say, it must take deliberate effort. If people stand on the wall and say, we can't go to this country because it's weak, then nothing is going to happen. We need to go there deliberately and do things that can change things. And this is my appeal to my colleagues from industry, that they need to partner with us, as Margaret said, not sit on the fence and wait and say, we'll go there until things improve. Let's work together to improve and, conduct clinical research as a whole, which makes scientific relevance. If you look at epidemics, Ebola, and all these other hemorrhagic fevers, they come from corners of the continent where there is no strong regulation at all. And that's a double-edged sword for us. So we really need to find solutions that are making scientific sense. Next slide, please. So coming back to strengthening of regulation, I want to just spend a little bit of time here. This map shows the countries that EDCTP has supported to give grants to NRAs to strengthen themselves. Now, when we talk about strengthening NRAs, I thought for myself, before I got into this, that it's really, really complex. But sometimes, as some of the colleagues said, what NRAs need is just a proper office where they can work from, a proper administrator, digitized solutions so they can turn the paperwork that gives them a headache into some form of touch of the button, gadgets, and makes their work simple. And for EDCTP, this has been an experience of a small grant as 50,000 euros for 3 years. You can turn around the function of an NRA. And by the time they require a bigger grant, they are already ready, going. And colleagues have already talked about the perfect examples of NRAs that have moved from rags to riches in terms of expertise, reaching WHO maturity level 3. I won't go much into detail, but I just wanted to hit on this because it's not rocket science, and in many countries, it doesn't need a lot of investment that you can call is lost income, especially for colleagues that do science for business. This is a point I would like to make over and over again. Next slide, please. So I have talked quite, briefly. Very difficult for me to give all the facts you need in terms of how the research looks like, the research platform in Africa, but I hope that sparks the discussion. And I would like to just hammer on these 3 points again, that it is really up to us all to make Africa have its sound regulatory framework it requires to support all the clinical trial phases it should harbor based on historical science that I've talked about of genetic impact on interventions. Together, we can build one healthy global village. Thanks, Kevin.
Thank you so much, Thomas. I really appreciate that. A very nice presentation. Colleagues, I think you've seen, moving from thus articulating the resolution itself, which of course is in the best interest of clinical trial landscape and ecosystem in Africa, through to the overview provided by Thomas in terms of the progress actually that we have made. I think that it's always important not to focus on what is not working, but really show what has worked and how we can collectively build on that. If I can just jump on what Thomas said at the beginning of his presentation, I'm going to also say something also quite radical. It might sound radical. So Thomas said any clinical trial of diseases of global importance should first be done in Africa. I agree. And I also say the following, because I think industry is one part. We're talking about stakeholders, as we will see as part of this panel discussion. But there's another part, which is the countries in Africa themselves. And I would say, just like Thomas said about clinical trials, I would also say every regulator in Africa should require and demand local clinical trial data before a product is approved. That will force the issue of then us building capacity because of the policy and the regulatory requirement to have local clinical trial data. Okay, clinical trials must start in Africa, and African nations must demand local clinical trial data. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, friends, we're now going to switch into a panel discussion. We have 3 of our colleagues representing different sectors. We have Derek representing the innovative pharmaceutical industry, well, of course, members of the IFPMA. And we have Shingai representing the African Union, Africa CDC, bringing that perspective from the Africa CDC perspective. And finally, but not least, we have Jacqueline Rogers, representing the AVREF Secretariat that is really, really instrumental in clinical trials happening on our continent of Africa. It's a real pleasure to really moderate this panel discussion. All of the panelists have one question that I'm going to ask them, and they will each have 3 minutes, and I'm sure they will respect the 3 minutes. They will not go over 3 minutes. They've assured me. They saw under oath that they will not go beyond 3 minutes. And so they will give a perspective to this one question that I'm going to present to them, but from their perspective. And that's the session that we're going to be entering on right away. So the question is the following. And I will start with Derek to start off with, and that will be followed by Shingai, and then Jacqueline as the last person to respond to this question. So the question is, how are you, your organization specifically, involved in clinical research or clinical trials in Africa, and or facilitating the implementation of this World Health Assembly resolution that Vasi spoke about? I'll say the question again. How are you and your organization you are representing today, how are they involved, or you are involved in clinical research or clinical trials in Africa, and or facilitating the implementation of this World Health Assembly resolution? Derek, over to you.
Oh, thank you, Kelly. Maybe to start with, personally, I'm responsible for capacity building in Johnson & Johnson Global Public Health. And for all of our programs, we go to Africa finding the patients that we need, HIV, tuberculosis, Ebola, and so on. And of course, we see increased risks and challenges, and we have been analyzing those risks and challenges first. J&J has been sponsoring the African Academy of Science and the Dalberg consultancy company to look at all of the clinical and translational capabilities of Africa. And that report has revealed a lot of strengths and initiatives that have been taken over time by funders, by governments, by academic sites, but it also revealed important weaknesses. And recently in 21, there was also the SIMES report that also did that full analysis of strengths and capabilities, but also weaknesses in the system. And you see the same issues coming back, issues related to skilled professionals, about no good mechanism for collaboration between funders, industry, research organizations, the regulatory environment not being conducive, gaps in infrastructure, weak compensation and brain drain of the people. So again, we have been trying to look at all of those elements. And also, if you want to be successful in clinical research, you also need to work on those different components. And I'll go a little bit different, trying to bring the topic immediately on what we think is very important is that we can collaborate with the different partners at the industry on one hand, but and with other pharma companies, but also with academics, with the governments, to really be successful. And one point I want to stress on that is that we have been working together on a consortium, an EDCTP initiative supported initiative that is called the Clinical Trial Community African Network. And if you want to bring more clinical trials to Africa, particularly also from the industry, then you want to make sure that you know exactly where you can find your patients. And that means that you need to have a good view on the epidemiology of the countries and sites. The second element is also, of course, because of the registration purpose, that you need high quality sites and labs, and being able to identify them and have them listed would be another very important aspect for the industry to come to the sites. And the third element is indeed what already was mentioned. A lot of work was done by WHO, AVREF, and other aspects on the regulatory processes, but also still more can be done. And we can see how can we maybe also as industry support the trainings, help with looking at the data, improving the data, and work with the data to improve the processes on the longer run as well. So in that CityCan initiative, we try to bring them together, those different initiatives together with the right partners, very diverse partners. And I think that's a very important project going forward. I stop here, my 3 minutes are over.
Thank you very much, Derek. And of course, when my camera is on, that's a warning that you're pretty close. But thank you very much for that insight. We're going to go straight and hear from Shingai, representing the Africa CDC and the African Union. Shingai, over to you.
Thank you so much, Kelly, and to the organizers for inviting Africa CDC to take part in this panel. So I think I'll start by just bringing you back to the new public health order. And this is a vision and framework which the Africa CDC is spearheading. And under the new public health order, there are 5 pillars: strengthening public health institutions, strengthen public health workforce, expanded manufacturing of vaccines, diagnostics, and therapeutics, increased domestic financing for health, and respectful and action-oriented partnerships. So I think these 5 pillars are really the guiding framework for the work that the Africa CDC is doing, of course, together with other AU agencies, such as the AUDA NEPAD, the Continental Free Trade Area, soon to be the African Medicines Agency, and of course, all partners, regional and global as well. When we talk specifically about clinical trials, I think everyone talks about COVID-19, but I think the real catalyst for change was actually the Ebola outbreak and the lessons that were learned, the big Ebola outbreak from 2014 to 2016. And that really catapulted and emphasized the need for Africa CDC. And there were many lessons that were learned there and re-emphasized again during COVID. And, you know, one of the main things, I think Tom has already touched on it, was the fact that, you know, when it comes to clinical trials, most of the decisions are being made elsewhere. And we are just a recipient of what has been decided elsewhere. And we were quite powerless during the COVID-19 pandemic when it came to what trials must be conducted and where and how. There were so many complexities which we then had to try and work through. And I think this is really where Africa CDC has decided to say, okay, so what can be our value addition in this area? And so we are working on establishing a mechanism that allows us to coordinate clinical trials in a better way. Not only coordinate, but empower our member states, right? There's already been talk about, you know, a regulator should only accept a product that has been tested in Africa. These are the kinds of issues that we really want to spearhead to sort of help to restore the power balance. So working together with AUDA NEPAD, we're hoping to establish a clinical trial coordination mechanism, which over the next 10 years will transform how clinical trials are being conducted in Africa by harmonizing, directing, and coordinating how big clinical trials are being conducted. The idea is that within this 10-year period, we'll be able to identify key clinical trial sites that are sustainable. And by sustainable, we mean those that have co-funding both from international partners as well as government, as well as international partners. But to look at these and grow the sustainable network using different tools that we can harmonize across Africa, allowing us to have a network of clinical trials which not only will facilitate more efficient and more impactful clinical trials and drive down the costs, but mean that in the case of emergencies, which is one of the core functions of Africa CDC, we have a reliable network of clinical trial sites which we can easily implement clinical trials at a fast pace. So I'll stop there, Kelly. I see your camera is on, so I hope I did stick to my 3 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Shingai. No, the camera, when the camera is on, is just a warning that soon it will be time over. So thank you so much, Shingai. Much appreciated. And please to the audience, please gather your questions and put them in the Q&A chat that we're going to be able to answer those questions when we start in almost 5 minutes time. We start a general Q&A that will involve both of us, Thomas and my colleagues right now are part of this panel. So please put in your questions in the chat so we can have a good conversation afterwards. So finally, but not least for this session, Jacqueline Rogers, representing Averith, Secretariat based at the WHO in Geneva. And thank you for being here, Jacqueline. I know you had weather issues and storms in your area, so good to see that you haven't dropped off. Over to you.
Thank you, Kelly, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I would just, in response to your question, like to perhaps explain a bit of the dynamics between the AVRF Secretariat, the WHO, AMRH, and the AVRF network. The AVRF network is ethics committees and national regulatory authorities in the continent of Africa, all 55 countries. Now, the work that AVRF Secretariat does is to support the AVRF network within WHO. The office of the AVRF Secretariat exists in the WHO Afro-Regional Office. The advantage we have as the AVRF Secretariat is that we are able to reach out to partner organizations and donors who provide funding for the activities of AVRF, as well as technical support from other regulatory bodies like Swissmedic, EMA, the US FDA, Health Canada, and so on. That's in the first session, Mariana from WHO used the term SRAs, Stranger Regulatory Authorities and Organizations, to explain. So how does this work? The main function of the Secretariat is to support the network, the AVRF network, to achieve their goals in capacity building, that is both regulatory as well as ethics committee for interventional trials. And the whole idea is preparing the continent towards the vision of the African Medicines Agency in clinical trial oversight. Currently, we have had over 26 countries within the continent that have participated in at least one multi-country joint review clinical trial application facilitated by the AVRF Secretariat and WHO. Prior to the COVID pandemic, these were physical meetings. These were held as physical meetings, but in adaptation to COVID, we are working virtually now, going more towards a hybrid approach because it's good for these networks to be able to relate face-to-face with one another as well. And within AVRF, we have the heads of agencies network, that's for the NRAs, and then we also have the ethics committees network, which is in stages of infancy for national ethics committees, as well as representatives from IRBs. Our partners are Africa CDC, as well as other organizations, but we're all working towards achieving this new order where we are able to work together hypothetically on a continental level and have a multi-country clinical trial reviewed by participating countries in the continent for one decision. And this is the aim. Now, what have we done so far? We have worked with Harvard University, MRCT, to develop a training course for ethics committees. And then we've also worked with individual national regulatory authorities to help them achieve clinical trial oversight maturity 3 according to WHO Global Benchmarking Tool. So these two areas, in addition to the service offering that Vasi summarized on his slide during his presentation, and I'll have to end here somehow. 3.5 minutes just flew. Thank you for your attention. Over.
They say, Jacqueline, thank you very much. They say time flies when you're having fun, because we're having fun. That's why the time is flying. So, yeah. So thank you very much, Derek, Shingai, and Jacqueline for those perspectives. I know there was time pressures, but I hope that your brief remarks will catalyze some discussions as part of this session. Again, to the audience, please type in your questions in the Q&A chat function here. This is not intended to be a series of lectures, but this is really for us to engage with the speakers and of course have a discussion about this matter that affects all of us as stakeholders. So I guess while people are thinking about what to ask a little bit later, actually, maybe I should just say this before I go here. Every time these days when people are talking, they're always referring to COVID. Oh, as COVID showed, as COVID showed, as COVID showed. But actually, Shingai rather, reminded me that in fact, as far as we are concerned in Africa, Ebola really as an epidemic provided a blueprint at many levels of how not just clinical trial infrastructure being repurposed towards Ebola, but also some novel, funding mechanisms, that were really innovatively brought to the fore as a consequence of the continent responding to an epidemic of that nature. So, yeah, so let's not just refer to COVID the whole time. Before COVID was Ebola, at least for us on the African continent. So I guess because Jacqueline, you were the last speaker, so which means I'm assuming that then you're still very fresh from talking. So maybe while people are looking for questions to ask, maybe I could start off with you. I mean, Avaref, we heard from Thomas's presentation just clearly, very good progress being made in the numbers of clinical trials that are being done in Africa. And of course, we should focus on that progress and how we can build on that momentum. So with Avaref, what is your largest clinical trial that Avaref has conducted in Africa, or facilitated, not conducted, facilitated? And I would love to know also how many countries were involved in that effort.
Okay, so the largest trial to date was actually for, I don't want to belabor this point, but a COVID-19 therapeutic intervention. And this was 12 countries from 4 regional economic communities within the continent. And there would have been between 18 to 20 actual sites from these 12 countries. Now, this was early in the pandemic. Since then, we have fine-tuned the procedure, but in this trial, the outcome was a decision on the clinical trial application within 30 days for 89% of the participating countries. And since then, we have built on this. There are 3 procedures available for developers. We've got the 30-day expedited joint review procedure, and then a 15 and 10-day for emergency situations, which was also employed during the Avaref facilitation of emergency use authorization for COVID-19 candidate vaccines, which is a whole different area of work. I wouldn't go into that now. However, I would just like to conclude by saying that a lot of lessons have been learned. We also have held training sessions with the countries, the ethics committees, and the NRAs to familiarize them with the process. We have got digital platforms that we use to support virtual reviews and the virtual procedure. So it is very much a work in progress, but we're in a comfortable place now where we are confident that we can apply this platform for more innovative style protocols. And we're looking at interventional controlled human infection model studies as a possibility, as well as antivenom products and similar products where there isn't much experience in the continent. And this is because the facilitated joint review procedures that we support as WHO and Avaref Secretariat are also give the possibility of capacity building and strengthening decisions on multi-country trials where the individual countries perhaps may not have the competency within the country. So it's an interim solution that has proved to be very useful, where the capacity may not be existing. However, ability or possibility to lean on EMA in the case of RTSS malaria vaccine, when the Article 58 recommendation was given by EMA, we were able to leverage on this using the Avaref procedures. I'll end here. I've got so much to say, but there is no time. Thank you for your attention.
No, thank you so much. That's very, very informative and very, very helpful. Thank you so much. There is a comment. I mean, I won't necessarily ask every one of you to answer this question, so please don't worry about this. I'll read it. And I'd just like to invite anybody who would like to make any specific comments on this. It's not really a question, it's a comment. I think it's something that somebody has put in the chat. And so I'm going to read it slowly, and hopefully that you can cut it, or you've seen the comment. So this is from Gordon Takopanchanji, and it says, Africa on the receiving end is one core aspect. I agree, it needs to be sorted. I think one part of the solution is that we reach a point where we can fund a significant proportion of the clinical trials, especially those of diseases largely affecting us. I think we should explore models of how we can raise funds and carry out these trials by Africans for Africa. So I guess this comment is really about why not mobilize resources, mobilize funding to do clinical trials on the diseases that predominantly affect the African patient population. So would anybody like to comment on that or make any remarks on that? Vasi, please go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you. I think many people would agree with this person, with this comment. And I think there are a couple of aspects to it. Firstly, of course, it has to be pivotal once there is domestic funding to support clinical trials. And so whatever we can do to make the case, and it's interesting which countries are already doing this. If you look at the sort of GDP per capita of countries around the world, and then which ones are really supporting the clinical trials ecosystem, it's not always a direct link. There are some of the countries which have a lower GDP per capita, which really have decided that it's in their own economic interest to support their health R&D ecosystem. And some of those countries, seems to have helped their economic development. So I don't know how we can make that case to the politicians. But I think the other part of this is that, and I know that many of the funders, the international donors, are looking at strategy sort of refreshes, and can we find a way of really supporting or endorsing funding approaches from international donors which actually support really sustainable ongoing capacity development that is left behind and is meeting needs, is starting with the needs that are articulated, rather than the top-down approaches which may not have that sustainability afterwards. So I think those are two angles I would have on that comment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vasi. Thank you so much. Any Shingai, you look like you're ready to speak. Yeah, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you so much. So I think that's a very important question. And if we look at the history of research in Africa and the engagement with policymakers and domestic financing, it's not actually that it wasn't recognized that health research needs to be funded domestically. We actually do have agreements. We do have commitments, but I think it's the accountability and the competing interests that our member states have. So you have on paper what African countries have agreed to contribute towards health research and R&D, but practically getting these finances is what the challenge is. And I think what needs to happen is there needs to be a shift in how we view research and R&D, that it is actually an investment, right? That this is contributing to our health security, because if we don't have this infrastructure and we're not able to conduct clinical trials, we're not able to produce different products, etc. If we can make this connection to say that this is actually a matter of our health security, I think this becomes a language that our politicians can understand. And it then allows us to access finances which are set aside specifically for health security. So I think we need to sit around the table and really have good conversations for people to understand that when we talk about R&D and we talk about clinical trials, it's not just for scientists and people like Kelly who have fancy labs and who can do, all sorts of experiments. It's actually something that is practical and affects all the people and the populations in our countries, and also has direct impacts on our economies, right, positively and negatively. So I think that's one. And then the second thing would be to say, you know, when we talk about what kind of research is happening or what clinical trials are happening, one of the biggest gaps that has existed for Africa is that we don't really have a research agenda. We conduct research and conduct clinical trials according to what is largely available for our researchers to access. So how do we shift that? How do we as Africa actually come and say, these are our priorities? Sit around the table with our partners and say, we would really need you to help us fund these priority areas. Because if you look at the disease spread, the epidemiology around Africa, you know, some diseases affect certain regions, certain countries, and economically R&D is obviously driven by finances, profits, the pharma industry, etc. Some of these diseases are not going to be attractive for big pharma to invest in. It's attractive to us, and we are the ones who have to actually take ownership and rally around specific diseases to say, well, actually, if we look at NTDs, why are we not able to produce a vaccine or a drug or a diagnostic at this amount of cost? Because if we do this over this period of time, we can actually help to save money in the long term. So I think we just really need to be able to rally around what are our priorities, one, but then two, change the narrative and the way in which we frame our cases or business case of why we need to invest in certain products for certain disease areas, which may not necessarily be attractive or necessarily be a profit maker for the private sector. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Shingai. You actually touched on some really important points. And I think I remember when I was setting the scene for the discussion, you know, often, you know, I always try to remind people that of course there is a health aspect when we talk about clinical trials. Why it's important for us Africans, not only to increase the number of clinical trials that are happening on the continent, as we saw from Thomas's presentation, but also importantly, the number of Africans participating in those trials. So that's an obvious health implication. But as you say, there is also a business implication. Somebody has to fund the clinical trial. Somebody has to build the infrastructure that is there. And of course, you attract foreign direct investment. So I think we need to articulate more the business case for doing clinical trials. I don't think this has probably been going across very strongly, because I think every time I listen to, I go to meetings, I go back to 30 years ago, I'm hearing the same things. To your point, Shingai, it's implementation. People have already talked about what the problem is. Actually, I don't even want to hear about the problem, because we all know what the problem is. It's implementation is a problem. But also when you look at the issue of whether you're going to develop products for yourself or whatever, is that when we build clinical trial infrastructure, a lot of what has bedeviled continuity in these things is that there isn't really a pipeline of projects. Of course, you can get projects from whoever is interested in testing it on your population. But to your point, Shingai, unless we also locally invest in R&D, that then allows us, when there are economies of scale, to develop products that can also feed the clinical trial pipeline. I mean, it's not even just mitigating failures, which of course we know things can fail in clinical trials, but importantly, to contribute to a pipeline of projects so that those clinical trials capabilities and infrastructure don't go to waste. There's a continuum of projects that we feed into there. Any other comments, colleagues, to that important question or important comment? Maybe while you're thinking, I'm just interested, sorry if I throw anyone off balance here, but I really want to go back to the Ebola pandemic. I think we saw some innovative financing mechanisms. And so this is really a question to maybe to Shingai or anybody, what can we learn from the Ebola epidemic in terms of this innovative financing mechanisms within the continent to address epidemics that might not affect the whole world, but affect us?
Okay, so maybe I'll go first, and my panelists can add to my comments. So I think not just Ebola, if you look at it in terms of where the financing for clinical trials have largely come from, it's from the global north, and this is a fact. And so, the question then that we have to think about is to say, how do we shift this so that we have, it may not be equal, but we actually have a significant contribution from the global south in terms of how to finance these. If you look at what happened with COVID, of course, due to circumstances which you don't need to go into detail, but we saw the birth of AVAT, right? And this was a unique financing mechanism in partnership with Afro-Exim Bank, where they facilitated and guaranteed African member states to be able to access the Johnson & Johnson vaccines, right? So these are the kinds of initiatives that we have to stop and say to ourselves, if we were able to do this for COVID, what's stopping us from doing this for other types of clinical trials? And that's just one example. We have also what was called the, I think it's now being called the Africa Epidemics Fund. It was started initially to respond to COVID, but within the Africa Union, they are now saying, how do we take this and move it to an epidemics fund that's just not focused on COVID, but it is a pooled fund that allows us to raise funds that are available for member states to be able to access to respond to epidemics and to pandemics. So I think there's already lessons learned and mechanisms that have been built. And the question is, how do we sustain these or adapt them from something that was very specific to responding to one pandemic to mechanisms that can be readily available in the future for African member states. And then I also think the other element that needs to come into this discussion is the way our partnerships are set up, right? So historically, we always had partnerships where a lot of the times we would receive and we would accept. And I think what needs to happen now is we need to have a more open conversation and to say, okay, well, we don't think this partnership suits, the trial participants as well as it should, or we require these additional benefits, etc. So it's that respectful, equal, action-oriented partnerships that we need to look at and think about, because if we're able to bring a better balance within some of these research partnerships, you'll see that the capacity, etc., starts to balance off. And then, of course, this contributes as well to what we're discussing. So I will stop there. I could go on, but maybe others have some comments. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Shingai. Yeah, I guess, was that Thomas? Was that Derek? Was it Thomas about to talk? Or? Oh,
maybe just one quick comment, because I've been very intensively involved over the last 3 years and for the Ebola programs in Africa for J&J. And what you see on one hand is that, again, that partnership is incredibly important, and also the fundings, because J&J have always been donating the vaccine so far for those programs, 200,000 vaccination program in Rwanda, 50,000 in West Africa, another 25,000 2 times 25,000 DRC. But we also have global funders supporting as well. We had the Wellcome Trust for one, we had CEPI for another one, we had the World Bank for another one. So I think that combination is really critical. And the third element is that those trials and programs also need to be done in a very cost-effective way. And then the local partnerships, working with the local partners at local cost is also a critical component to make those programs very cost effective. Just to finish that, but we had done a 2,000 pregnant women trial, a controlled trial in Rwanda, and that is done at the highest quality. We had 2 inspections from Rwandan FDA. We also had an internal audit on that, and the quality of the trial was really extremely high, and we will publish the data also very soon. So again, high quality data is absolutely possible. We all know that. Finding the right partners to make that happen, the right mix of expertise and resources is really critical, including co-funding as well.
I think that's a very important point. When we're talking about partnerships, and I'll go to Vasi in a second. Really, it's going to take partnerships. That's why I think the comment in the question that we have been responding to, there's just no way that we in Africa can do it alone. Not because we can't do it alone, but we actually don't need to do it alone, because these are human problems. They're not African problems. And so I think it's sharing risks and sharing benefits as well. But I think the importance of transparency in these partnerships is very important. I'll go to Vasi and then Thomas.
Thank you. I think it's such an important topic. I think there were 3 points I wanted to make just very briefly. One is, if you look at even some high-income countries, one aspect, I think, of what can make clinical trial capacities self-sustaining or sustainable is attracting investment from the private sector. If you look at, some of the high-income countries, they're actually specifically, making the case that they are the place to go to conduct clinical trials. So that can interact it. And we need to sort of distinguish between exploitative trials, which, would be trials which are not answering any kind of needs and are not done in the right way with, really useful inward investment. So I think that's a really important point, that it's not either or. We should be looking to attract inward investment. But at the same time, it has to be somehow linked, and Shingai mentioned this, unless we have some clarity about what the needs are, then it becomes much more difficult to really understand what the overlap is between the trials that people want to do and what actually are needed. So we had a whole process where we went to a large number of national research councils a few years ago, and we asked them, how things were working. And what the 80% of those countries, this was not only in Afro, this was globally in the global south, said that they've gone through national research agenda setting exercises. And so there were large numbers of these research. There are not so many regional ones, but there are many national ones. They're not always kept up to date, but they generally said, they don't see people coming and funding according to what they've asked for. There's a disconnect between what they've asked for and what people, want to do. So that's obviously something that we need to address. And then the third point is, I just wonder if we really have all of the metrics that we need if we're going to track capacity development. We have this for NRAs with a maturity level framework. And I think a lot of the countries with the resolution, the inputs at the board, the WHO board, from the middle and the low income countries were generally, we really badly want to support our own capacity development. And they did say that they would welcome some further input from WHO as to what the framework should be, because that is clearly there for regulatory authorities. To some extent, it's there for research ethics committee oversight. It's not so much there for research institutions. There are some sort of clinical research operation capacities that I think are fairly clear. So I think there's a little bit more work that we have to do there on how to make sure that we are, taking research institutions to the next level, and that whatever funding is going in is leading to the capacities that are needed. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Avas. And just to warn the audience, I might disappear for a minute or two because there's a scheduled power cut in my area, but it will kick in. So if you see me suddenly dark, just understand. But I'm just giving you a heads up. Hopefully, I'll be spared, but just a warning. Thomas, you're going to have the final word on this. Please go ahead.
Yeah, just quickly, thanks, Chair. On the point of looking at partnerships differently, it's really a very serious point, because I think if well handled, it will make a huge difference. The point Shingai raised, the aid or assistance or whatever name you give it when it comes as if it's going to function in vacuum. And that's only factor you have in the ledger. So somebody brings 1 million euro and they say, I brought 1 million euro in your country, as if they have taken it to the moon. But we know where these scientists are working. It's a private land. It's a company's land where they build their labs. They're not paying any rent. They are opportunity costs. The weakness is the accounting on the other side, that we don't have people who can give us the figures that for this trial that GSK brought into Malawi, this is the cost Malawi paid. And if they did the maths, you'd be shocked that it would probably be 10 times, 5 times what cash comes into the bank, if you see what I mean. Because economics is not just the money you bring in, it's everything. The participants, they move from villages, they go to trials, they give the blood samples. Nobody costs that. A blood sample of a child that is flown to New York to a lab for analysis, nobody values that. But if we are going to put a value to that, then we'll see that we are at equal par. Now, telling a government that you don't contribute anything at all. It's a bad tactic. But producing some form of a figure and say, you know, Minister, you're already doing a lot to this trial. You are actually putting in 5 times what GSK is putting. It makes a difference. And if I was a minister, then I could go back to the president and say, look, we're doing a very good job. We need more money. So something like that is, for me, strategic. And we need strategic thinkers who can help us come up with those kind of strategies so that when Shingai is implementing them from Africa Union, they become really, really helpful for the continent. And that can make the type of partnerships that we have start to look equitable. Because at the moment, they are slopped because what is valued is just cash that comes from one bank in Europe to another bank in Africa. This is bad science. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thomas. And I really just, for me, whenever I think about partnerships, to me, it's not always about the cash. I think any kind of partnership, someone has to bring something to the table. But I think it's acknowledging what those contributions are. And I think, Thomas, to your point, it shouldn't be something that is just given as a negative thing at all. But I think it's acknowledging the contributions that come in different forms. I really, really want to thank my colleagues here, Derek, Jacqueline, Shingai, Vas, and Thomas, for your time and your input. We unfortunately have come to the end of the session, and I hope that you've really found it as enjoyable as I did in really understanding this resolution and, of course, the important thing that we can do around clinical trials. We already have seen good progress made, and the momentum that's being built around the clinical trial platform that Derek was talking about, the progress we've seen in the number of clinical trials Thomas was showing, but also remembering that it's not just selecting those countries where historically trials have been done. Let's go to the ones that look like they're really, really the weakest and really look to strengthen them. Because unless we do that regionally across the continent, we will not benefit from the economies of scale, especially when we are doing pivotal trials that require multiple countries to be involved in. All right, what we have in front of us, really the takeaways from everything that the panelists have been describing over the last little while, which of course is the point I was emphasizing already. The first bullet is really that we've seen a good increase in the number of clinical trials. If we look at the number in 2003 to 2021, that's positive. And let's focus on what we can learn from what are the contributing factors that have led to this increase, and how can we do more to address this as well. Secondly, we've seen the growth in the clinical trial, number of clinical trials and research ecosystem in Africa, but also tremendous capacity building efforts from multiple sources, including the industry, EDCTP, and many other funders in building capacity, including capacity in ethics and the regulatory oversight that we see. Those are very encouraging messages that we should take forward as we move forward. And of course, the whole thing about this session was about this World Health Assembly resolution and really, really looking to see how we can jump on this wonderful, wonderful resolution to address best practices for doing clinical trials, both the design and implementation, so that we can generate quality evidence. It's about the patient. The patient needs a medicine of the right quality and the right safety, and of course, the right efficacy. So that is important in building, making Africa an attractive destination for clinical trials, when we can guarantee quality of our medicines, of our products, and our clinical trials. So really, really important that this is done internationally, coordinated internationally, to make sure that Africa offers the best of the best in terms of the quality of clinical trials that we generate and the evidence that comes from these trials. And finally, but not least, of course, is the importance of really building the clinical trial infrastructure so that we build it not to react to an epidemic or a pandemic when it happens, but to prepare for the pandemic. We don't need to be reminded once again by Ebola that we need to build and maintain and sustain the clinical trial infrastructure. And so we should not be reactive, we should be proactive, so we can build the right infrastructure to prepare pandemics. But also, finally, but not least, what we have to boost the R&D capacity in Africa is not just about clinical trials and providing clinical trial sites and patients. It's building capabilities and capacities to do research and development that feeds not just in clinical development, but also in the preclinical phase of the process, so that we see everything as a continuum, that we don't just address one component and not the other. And that's, I think, is the message I'm getting from this track. I want to really thank once again, thank my colleagues, the panelists for their time, for their input, IFPMA for coordinating and arranging this meeting. To all the people that attended this session, thank you so much for your time and your interest in this. And of course, remember, tomorrow is FRC Day 2. How can regulatory collaborations help achieve patient-centric impact? That is an exciting session happening tomorrow at 1 o'clock Central Eastern Time. Thank you so much, and greetings from Cape Town. You can see suddenly the meeting is by candlelight, but at least you could see most of the time I was bright and shining light in my office. And so thank you so much indeed, and enjoy the day, the evening, wherever you are. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.